Today is April 21st, 2024. We're here to interview Agnes Klein, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. The interviewer is Esther Andor, and the videographer is Robert Wilson. We're doing this interview under the auspices of the Yossi Shaw Foundation, and the interview is going to be done in English.
And recording.
Okay, so good morning.
Good morning.
Agnes. Thanks for agreeing to doing this interview. I will start by asking you to tell me your first name and last name, as well as married name, and spell them.
So my first name is Agnes, my second name is Klein, that's my married name. My maiden name is Stössel.
How do you spell Agnes?
Agnes.
And Stössel?
Sto with the umlaut, Ssel.
Could you tell me where you were born?
I was born in Brasov, Kronstadt, which is in Transylvania, and it is the town where the famous, infamous or legendary Dracula castle exists. It's a very interesting town because it is a old medieval town, but even before that, there is remnants of Roman fortifications, and there are all the 12th century buildings around the main city square already in existence, and it still houses the city hall, the town hall, and they use the plaza for all kinds of public events. And it's a very lovely town in the mountains, similarly to the Laurentians in Canada. And it was the winter resort for the royal family, which was, I think, one of the factors why we were never included in the annexation of portions of Romania to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as a result, I think we were in a slightly better situation than other people during World War II.
We're going to come to that. Could you tell me when you were born?
And I was born January 31st, 1937.
Okay. Now, first we're going to go back to your grandparents, great-grandparents. I know that you told me a story about a maternal great-grandfather who was in the army, and about his marriage. That was
that was my story. Maternal, my maternal great-grandfather from her father's side. He actually was recruited into the Austro-Hungarian Empire because he was in a part of Romania where at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Military service, according to my mother, was 13 years, and at 18 he left. As he left, he saw this little girl, the next door child, playing with the other children, and he told her father that when I come back I will marry your daughter. And so 13 years later he married my great-grandmother. They had 18 children, of whom 16 reached adulthood, got married and had children of their own. We don't know what happened to them. We presume that they all perished, with one exception who went to the United States, and eventually the family lost track of him. He didn't communicate. His wife didn't want him to communicate, whatever it was. The last two were twins. One of them died young, at age 14 of renal failure, of glomerulonephritis, because there wasn't the treatment that we have today. And the other one died at age between somewhere 18 to 20 of tuberculosis. Otherwise, the others all grew up and became adults, got married and had children. By the best we know, some of them ended up in Budapest. And so that's that side. My grandmother's side, my grandfather was a tailor, and his wife was ill. She had some heart problems. They had 8 children, and my grandmother, who was the oldest one, brought up all of those children, including the youngest one, and especially the youngest one, who was whose son, or grandson rather, is a physician, or was, he's now retired, a physician in Toulouse.
Okay. What was the name of this grandmother?
And the grandmother, her maiden name was Bruder, her married name was Weiss, with a SZ.
And her first name?
And her name was Esther Malka.
Okay. Do you know where she lived?
She lived in Oradea Mare, Nagyvárad. The families, both from my father's side and my mother's side, came from Czechoslovak Republic. They were not sort of Hungarian proper or Romanian Jews to start with, but they are from my mother's side. The family lived in a town that was called Nagy Károly, Karola Mare, and Karola Mare actually burned down pretty much. So the town did not exist after a while at all. And so many of the Jews migrated towards east, and most of them who were in that town ended up in places like Romania and Hungary.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what your maternal grandfather's occupation was?
My maternal grandfather, he was a tailor. He was a master tailor. So was my grandfather. He had apprentices and the like, and he was quite well known in the area, and that's what he did. My paternal grandfather, as I always like to say, had two honorable biblical occupations. He was an ordained rabbi from the Bratislava seminary, but he was also a sheep farmer, because sheep farming was in the family tradition. Some parts of the family were actually extremely well-to-do financially. He was probably one of the least well-to-do. I mean, certainly wasn't a poor man, but he certainly was not at the same level as his sort of that are part of the family that had the majority of the sheep. And nonetheless, he had quite a large flock, because he had his own. Plus, he had a contract with the town of Dej to look after the city pasture and look after the sheep that were being pastured there. And as you know, in these areas that are mountainous, in the summertime the sheep are brought down, and in the wintertime they brought down, and in the summertime they are taken up to the mountain, and that's where they get milked, and milk is made, and that's where it gets shorn, and the wool comes from there. And most of these had also some farming. They grew their own grapes and they made some kosher wine, but that was about, what they did. But the majority that was sheep farming. Eventually, because his wife died quite young, he moved into Dej and started a granary, what in North America is called an elevator, a grain elevator. And he lost everything when there was a strike, and the workers set fire to his silo. He actually, in those days they didn't have insurance, and he just felt totally lost and got his blood pressure really shot up. So that's the story. And he had a massive stroke and died. So my father's stepmother was left with 4 children to bring up, and my father, that's the way he got out of military service, because she had to put in a certificate to say that she needed him actually so she could make a living, to have him help with the children. There were some boys who were quite unruly, and they needed an older male presence to keep them in line, and so that's how my father, while he finished and became a chartered accountant, he actually wanted to go on to do political sciences and go into the diplomatic corps. That was his ambition, and he had a phenomenal political and knows actually. And he ended up by not going, because in those days going back at 30 or 32 to university was, you know, was not in the cards. Today that's quite normal, that people go back at any old age to get into university, and so that's what it was.
Let me stop you a little bit before we go on to your father. So your grandfather, what was his name, your father's father?
I was, Hermann Stössel.
Okay. And when you say that he had the flock, did he live with the flock up in the mountains in the
No,
summer?
they lived in a all Romanian village that was called Cetan, or in Hungarian they used to call it Csatán, but the people spoke primarily Romanian. There was very little Hungarian. There was some Yiddish spoken in the house, and so my father was really quite fluent in Yiddish. I mean, he also spoke German quite differentially from his Yiddish, and he had to actually learn Hungarian when we went to high school, because he got sent from there to Oradea Mare, to Nagyvárad, and he was boarded with some family they had there.
But going back to your grandfather, who looked after the sheep in the summer? Who was the person who went up with them to?
I frankly don't know. I think the children went up, but it was more holidays than anything else, and I imagine that they were helping as well around, but it wasn't only the children who went up. They were employees or whatever local people who were hired to look after the sheep. Because there were too many anyway. Those kids couldn't have ever taken care of those sheep. It wasn't a small operation.
You mentioned the word Esztana in Hungarian.
Yes,
can you
of
explain
course.
what that is?
Yes, that's the thing up on the mountains where you take the sheep.
It's the structure where the
shepherd
sleeps.
Yeah. But they also they also graze in pastures, by the way, up on the mountains. So.
And your grandfather had 4 children from his first marriage?
Right. Yes, and he had 4 children from his second marriage.
Okay, so he got married the second time?
He got married the second time, and his stepmother, in order to make a living, opened what was called the delicatessen shop, which was actually chocolates and candies. And she used to send us the most wonderful candies, and the boxes were just unbelievably fabulous, and was this high quality Lindt chocolate, what they call Katzenzungen, cat tongues, and you can't find that stuff anymore. Nobody makes them. Even Lindt doesn't make them anymore.
What was the name of your grandfather's first wife?
Helena Henrietta.
And the second, do you know?
And the second one, I don't know. Everybody called her Neni, the lady. And she was somewhat related to his first wife. I think she was the second or third cousin of his first wife.
Now, going back to your mother's parents, you didn't tell Yes, you did. No, you didn't tell the grandfather's name. I think.
My grandfather's name?
Your mother's father's
my
name.
My mother's father was... just a second, Zsigmond Elek Weiss. And his Hebrew name was Asher Zelig, with a Yiddish second one, which a lot of the people in Europe did that. But his name was Asher Zelig.
How religious were your grandparents on the two sides?
From my grandmother's, from my grandfather's, from my paternal side, they were Orthodox, really Orthodox, until I think, more into the 30s or so, for sure. From my mother's side, there were some extremely religious people. They were average, what you would call Orthodox people. My grandmother kept strictly kosher. And
were they Shabbat Shomer?
Pardon?
Were they Shomer Shabbat?
Yes, and certainly the Bruder grandfather. So my grandmother's name was Esther Malka Bruder, and they were actually quite religious. So the boys used to have to walk from their place to grandfather's place, where they had to go for every Shabbat. They went to grandfather's place, the boys, and they went with him to the synagogue. They would all had to be all properly dressed, appropriately, like grandfather expected it, and they went with him and his name was Joseph.
Did you know these grandparents, your mother's parents?
No, I didn't know my grandparents. I was lucky to know my grandparents. My sister never knew them because she was born in 1940 and June, and she was actually born the night that Paris was declared an open city, which is June 10 to 11. So she was born actually June 11, which was 15 minutes after midnight. So it was declared around midnight, just at midnight, June 10, and then she was born 15 minutes past midnight.
But you knew Zsigmond and Esther.
I knew Zsigmond, and they called her Malka Mali.
Mm-hmm. You knew them?
I knew them, yes.
Well, how did they dress? You said they were very Orthodox. How did they dress?
You know what? My grandfather was a tailor, so he was always dressed impeccably, like in a suit and thing. And what I remember is he used to take blades of grass and blow on them and crow with them like a rooster, and that still sticks in my mind. I remember that very clearly. And he really looks exactly like the photographs that I have of him. My grandmother was a little woman who was was dressed in black and skirts and whatever.
Did she wear a shaitel?
No, she didn't wear a shaitel because my grandfather said to his father-in-law, if you cut her hair, I'll leave her. So, he said, I'm not having a wife with a shaitel.
How about your grandfather? Did he have a beard?
My grandfather did not have a beard. He didn't have peyote, he didn't have a beard. He dealt with the public, so he really didn't.
How about wearing a kippah or a hat?
He wore a hat, but I don't think he wore a kippah all the time. I don't remember, though. I was 3 years old when I saw him the last time. And, I saw him before that, but I don't remember the times that my mother and I went visiting them.
Now, they had several children. Could you tell me about their children and what happened to their children? Your mother's siblings, basically. Yeah.
My mother's siblings. She was the fifth or the sixth down the line. She had one older sister, Margaret. The oldest brother was Alexander Shandor. The next one was William.
His original name?
William.
Willy.
They Hungaricized their name to Barsoy. I think that was because some other people in the family had Hungaricized their name to Barsoy, although that was never said to me, but I sort of put two and two together over the years. The next one was Andrew, who actually, so Andor, Geza, then my mother, then Clara, and Yanchi, John. The Andrew was lost as a POW in Russia during World War I. The other brothers all were served in the military during World War I. They then decided that they had enough of Europe, so that was even before the Depression. They had university degrees, but my grandfather insisted that they also have a trade, by the way. And so when they left Europe, They never actually worked. Getting their degrees validated was almost impossible. William stayed. He was a physician. The others were engineers. He was a physician, and he did very well. He was actually very well known. He was highly respected. He was a very nice man. Amongst, from my mother's side, I think him and Geza were our favorite relatives, bar none. We really did have bones to pick with her younger sister. She had some strange mentality things about her. And my mother put up with her because it was her sister, but you know, my sister and I used to kind of laugh behind her back.
Which one is this, Margit or Clary?
Clary.
Clary.
Clary. She had a chip on her shoulder too because she was shorter than the two of them. My Aunt Margaret was tall. When I mean tall, she was about 172 centimeters tall. Okay, so she was tall. My mother was 162. And Clary was what you would call 5 feet, about 156, 157, something like that.
You knew all of them?
I knew all of them.
In Romania?
No. I met them, those siblings who left Europe, I met them after the war because we went to South America after the war.
So which one stayed of the siblings?
William stayed
in
Oradea Mare, and he wasn't he got deported. He lost his wife, he lost his daughter. He came back. He actually remarried and had another child with his second wife, but I think the child died. His wife died young too, his young wife, and I think the child also had some problem. My cousin, who was in Toulouse, was visiting in last fall, and he said he followed him for a while, but then he just doesn't know what happened to him. Something, I think he had got leukemia and died or something like that. The story is quite young.
So that's Willy or Vilmos?
That's Vilmos, yeah, that's Willy.
And then who else stayed?
And my parents stayed, but we stayed in Brașov.
Yeah, but no one else. Everybody else went
Everybody
to South
else
America.
left. Yes.
To South America?
Yeah, yes, to South America. They actually wanted to go to United States, but it was very difficult and they wanted to leave very quickly, so they ended up where they could go. And that's how they got there.
What happened to your maternal grandparents during the war?
They ended up in the gas chamber.
But there is a story there, because I think you mentioned that...
Well, my father had asked them when they were there, when my sister was born, she actually asked my uncle as well to stay, because, and they said, oh no, because he said, my grandfather said, we're too old to move, or so on and so forth and so forth. And so they went back. And, you know, I sort of, shortly thereafter, I heard my parents lamenting that I wish they would have listened, you know, to us, because they just weren't listening. And it wasn't that at the time, that was still around 42, 43, so there was no ghettoing in that part of the country and no deportations from that part of the country. But what happened is that, you know, my father could see the writing on the wall, and they were not kind of listening to his advice. And I can only give them advice, I can't go beyond that.
Your father, what was his name?
Ignác
Stössel.
Stössel.
And where was he born?
He was born in Cetan, or in Dej, I don't know, maybe, my grandmother went to Dej to give birth, I don't know for sure, but he was is in that area, because Chetan is next to Dej.
What year was he born in?
In 1897. I don't remember. Don't ask me when my grandmother was born for sure. I know when my father was born. My mother was born in 1902 September the 1st.
We're still with your father. You mentioned that he wanted to be. He wanted to study political science. He couldn't, so he became a chartered accountant. Where did he work? What were his different works?
He actually had a very interesting career because he originally started working in the banking business. He worked also for the Austro-Hungarian Bank.
Where?
I think he spent some time in Vienna, frankly, that was, I'm not sure, but I think because he knew Vienna apparently very well based on his stories. And then he came back to Romania and he worked for this textile factory that's called Buhuș. It's still in existence because I sort of looked it up online.
It is in Buhuș, right?
It's a town called Buhuș, yeah.
Yeah, that's where it is, yeah.
Yeah.
I looked it up too.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about it though?
What I can tell you about it is that he worked for them and he was traveling around the country, so he knew a lot of people. And that's about all I know. And then when he they had a branch in Brașov, and his main area was sort of that part of Transylvania where he was traveling around for the company, but he used to go to Buhuș and then come back. And then when the war started, it was around 40 or 41, they sort of kicked him out. And he started another business with a Romanian fellow fronting it, and with another Jewish guy by the name of Meshulam Adler. Now everybody called him Meshulam, with the Yiddish pronunciation, of course. And he was, so they started this, and what they sold mainly is, yardage textiles. The Adler was a tailor, by the way, but they sold mainly yardage goods, and it was woolens, and these woolens that Buhuș produced were very much like the same quality as the British woolens. They were really high quality, so they did very well with that one.
Why did they need? Do you know why they needed a
front? Because a Jew wasn't allowed to have a business, and similarly, you weren't allowed to own property. So what they did is they sort of divided the home we had into two, and so we moved into upstairs, which became a separate apartment. The downstairs was rented, but the house was nominally deeded to a fellow by the name of Munteanu, who was the chief editor of the local newspaper. And then after the war, it came back to us, but we actually just left it when we left.
Was he a friend of your parents?
He was a good friend of my father's. He was a Roma, and curiously enough, very well educated, a real gentleman, married to a Romanian lady. They didn't have any children. He was a very nice man. I sort of remember seeing them a few times, but sort of, I was too young a child to remember, but I do remember them. And he was tall, she was equally tall, very pleasant people.
Tell me about your father. What kind of person was he?
Very smart. Quite a bit ahead of his time in many ways.
In what ways?
Well, his prime thing was you have to learn things first of all, he really pushed us to learn things. So we did learn quite a few things, both my sister and I. The other thing is that he always said you have to find yourself an occupation where if you're not married, you have a status in society, and you can keep, and you don't have to depend on anything or anybody to keep you. He would have loved to have a son, but given when my sister was born, there was no more. That was it. Nobody was having any more children. So a lot of the parents that age who grew up with me only had one child because they were all born in between 37 and 40, and they said, well, it's not in the cards. And so, my mother always said, everybody kept telling her, in these times, having a Jewish person having a child, what are you thinking of? And so she had a bit the philosophy of my grandmother, who said, well, it'll be what it'll be. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Not that she really thought about everything that way, but she thought about this in that way. And to the best, my recollection of the story she used to tell about my grandmother, that was her attitude. We shall overcome that one too.
How did he meet your mother, do you know?
There's a long story because my mother was briefly married after World War I to a young man who came back from the front, friend of her brother's, and he died shortly after he came back of tuberculosis. They literally almost hardly lived together, maybe a couple of months, and he got so sick that he was interned in the sanatorium. My grandmother never allowed my mother to go there to visit him. She actually threatened the parents, because the parents knew how sick he was, as to why he would want to, why they didn't tell her. My grandmother got extremely angry with one of the good friends of my uncle William Wilmosh, who they studied together medicine. He became an internist, and he was looking after this young man, and he knew exactly how sick he was. So my grandmother was very disappointed, because he was one of the poor boys that she brought into the house, brought him up and put him through school, not even a relative. She had always had one or two of these young boys in the house. Besides her 8, she had a couple of other ones. So my mother said there were always 10, 12 people. That was the regular thing around the table, plus a couple of apprentices for my grandfather. So there was, this huge household, and it was an average size home, but.
So she basically knew this boy from before the war, him growing up with them. Your mother knew this boy.
But she, they weren't going out. I mean, she was in school at the time. He was older, somewhat older.
So he died?
He died. He died 6 months later.
And then we're still at how your parents met?
Then my mother actually went to university to study law in Budapest. And after 2 years, anti-Semitism got so bad, and they called her so many times a dirty Jew, that she decided that she wasn't going to put up with this anymore, and went back home and then studied some fashion design. She knew how to sew because her grandfather was a tailor, and he insisted, as I told you, that to have all his sons learn a trade besides their profession. He insisted they go to university. He insisted that they learn a trade as well, except his youngest son, who didn't want to even go to high school. So he said, well, then you have to learn a trade. And he became a furniture maker. And he eventually actually became very well-to-do. He started a factory when he was in South America. He started a second one in Brazil. And he became very well-to-do. He was wealthy. I'm not saying he was a millionaire, but he was a wealthy man.
Going back to your mother, so she went back to
Oradea Mare, and she wouldn't have anything to do with anybody getting married at all. And my father was, at this point, about 30 37 or 38, and he was really complaining that he just couldn't find anybody. And he was friends with, although he was although my grandmother's youngest brother was older than my dad, they were good friends. And he said, "Do I have a girl for you?" So they introduced them, and that was it. That's how they met. And then 10 months later they got married.
What year did they get married in?
In 1936, April 5, and it was Erev Pesach. And my mother always said that I got all Pesach ready, Seder ready, everything ready, and then we had a wedding. And then Seder was the wedding banquet. It was a very small wedding. Nobody wanted a big wedding. I mean, they weren't that young, so. And how I got the name Victoria is because my father never thought that he would have any children, he would ever get married by this time. He had given up hope to find the right person. And he was just short of 40 when I was born, which were those days was, today it's nothing, right? But in those days it was old.
Yeah.
Well, he considered himself old.
Well, people, got children at a younger age. What was your mother's name?
Rose.
Roji.
Roji.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 7 or 8 cousins by the name of Roji, because it so happened that the grandmothers from both sides of her family were called Roji, and they were deceased. So all of these girls got the name Roji. And so you always had Roji, Rosie, Rojika, whatever, nicknames, so they would know which one was which.
What kind of person was your mother?
You know what? She was very smart, very good. I mean, she was fabulous in math. Neither my sister nor I have inherited any of those talents. She was really good at sewing. She was really good at inventing stuff and making do with things as time went, because then we had, during the war, there were no means of getting anything. And I actually have to tell you, I have a skirt that was my father's tuxedo. Well, it's like a British morning suit. It was with the striped pants. He had a set with the black pants and the striped pants and the white summer jacket and the winter and the tails and the regular black jacket. And she took it and made it into a skirt for herself. And for some reason or other, this skirt stayed around for a long time. And I found it when I was tidying some stuff after my mother died, and I actually fixed it up for myself, and I have it. And I wear it from time to time.
It's quite something.
It looks like a piece of modern piece. And I didn't do very much with it, I can tell you, but it's done.
You mentioned that...
and I get lots of compliments when I wear it. Yeah.
That when she went back, she studied design and she knew how to sew.
Yeah,
so
and
what did she do before her marriage in terms of work?
She was working with her father, mostly, before she was married, and she helped her mother in the house.
And once they got married, they settled in Oradea?
They settled in Brașov, because my father was there. She moved to Brașov.
Okay. What can you talked a little bit about Brașov and its ancient history, but can you tell me how big of a town with how big of a Jewish population was during
I'm not sure what the population was, but it was what you would call in European terms a medium-sized town. I think it might have had maybe 30,000, 40,000 people at the time. I guess now it's close to maybe 100,000 or thereabouts. Certainly wasn't as big as Oradea Mare. Certainly not as big as Cluj, and I remember that because, I was in both places when I was about 8, 9, and so I do remember. And I do remember being in Oradea Mare, and they had this skating place, and my cousin was skating in this, little skirt thing, dressed like, like a figure skater. So it was a sizable town, and it had a closed mall. This was, remember those galleries that you have in Europe with the closed things? I remember that. That sticks in my mind.
That's Cluj.
From Oradea Mare, yeah.
How about the Jewish population of Brașov?
I don't know how big it was, but there was an Orthodox synagogue, and then there was what they called the Neolog synagogue, which was really what I would call in current terms modern Orthodox. It had a gallery for women separately, and the men were separately, and there was no question of any girls or women going down into the sanctuary. Certainly it was large enough to, at high holidays or whenever there was a holiday, it was full, and I would say it held about 300-400 people, a total, all in the synagogue. There was no accessory or secondary thing. And it was a compound that held in the front on one side the offices with a large apartment on top. It was a ground floor and front story on one side, and on the other side was the day school. In the middle of the compound was the synagogue, slightly off center, and in the back there was a series of flat buildings that held all the Jewish organization services in the town. Like it was a Hadassah, it was a Naamat, it was whatever. There were about half a dozen small it was a single building, but a half a dozen separate offices in the back. I remember that very well, and it was a large compound.
Was there a mikveh in the compound?
I don't know, because I wouldn't have known. I expect there was a mikveh, but I don't know.
And the apartment above the offices, who lived there?
The rabbi lived there. The rabbi had two sons who was at the Haganah. At the time they were officers in the Haganah. He used to wander around, he used to walk around, and if people didn't speak Hebrew, he would say, "No, why aren't you speaking Hebrew?" And I think I said to him, I remember that, I said to him, "But I don't know enough." And he said, "Doesn't matter, just speak it."
The synagogue inside, you said it was a Neolog synagogue. Where was the bima? Was it in the middle or in the front?
I think it was in the front.
Was there a choir?
No. No, there wasn't a choir.
The neighborhood where your parents settled and where you lived before the war, could you talk about that neighborhood?
Yeah, it was a street that was called Prezan, Strada Marișal Prezan. There were some apartment buildings, there were some homes. Ours was a house that had been divided into two, and it was never put together again. Across the street there was a single home. There was a family with no children by the name of Farkas. She was a gym teacher, and we used to go and do gym twice a week or 3 times a week there with her, all the kids in the neighborhood. There were quite a few Jewish families in that street, boys and girls, and they all went there for gymnastics.
They were also Jewish, the Farkas?
Yeah. Peter was one of them, and then there was a family across the street too that we used to play a lot with 2 boys that was called Brüller. There was Otto and Robert. They ended up in Israel, I know that. Otto was about a year older than I am, and Robert was about a year and 2 years older than my sister. Otto, apparently Peter told me that he died quite some time ago, and Robert they all ended up in Israel. and Robert ended up in. He's in Israel, but he said he's got very severe dementia. The other person who actually grew up in our household is a girl who was my best friend by the name of Marion Shalushinsky.
She was Jewish? No.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
very much so. Marion Shalushinsky's father was the local OB-GYN person. Our parents were friends. Her mother was a cosmetician. Her mother's parents lived with them. They were supposed to look after her, but they never did, and so my mother looked after her most of the time because they lived a little bit further away, not on that street, somewhere else. They were in the of course, he was working all day and she was working all day. And so she was spent a lot of time there. And my mother says she remembers well that, she had very dark hair and she had picked up lice somewhere in school, Marion, and she was the one who cleaned off her lice because there was grandma who was supposed to look after her didn't. Marion ended up in Israel. She became a hematologist. She then married a fellow by the name of Sternbach, whose father was linked to the DuPont chemical factory. He had graduated, he was a chemical engineer. He graduated out of Queen's University and went back to Switzerland. The family had been linked with the DuPont company for a couple of generations. They ended up eventually, both him and her ended up in Israel. And from there, at one point in time when he was looking for a better job, they had no difficulty coming to Canada because he was a Canadian graduate. He didn't have to worry about bringing his degree up to par, so they ended up in Montreal. He was working for DuPont for quite some time, and then DuPont no longer exists. So he was floating about for some time without a job, and finally he got a job in Burlington at one of the Burlington in Ontario has got some airline manufacturing, engine manufacturing factories, and so he ended up there in the end. So that's how she ended up in Hamilton. I don't know what happened with her because I lost track of her. However, she actually became a pediatric hematologist oncologist in Montreal, and eventually she transferred to, she was an academic hematologist. She transferred, after a few years, she managed to transfer to Hamilton, and she did mostly adult hematology, which was a different kettle of fish, much less stressful. And as far as I know, she's still there. If she's alive, I don't know.
You talked about the neighbors and the houses. Were there any businesses in your neighborhood?
No.
No. So it was a residential.
Nothing. It was all residential.
So where did your mother do the shopping?
We went to the market. When the market was on in the main square, a couple of times a week, and we went to the market.
Okay.
And then there were a couple of stores on the main street because you had to go to the main street to get into the town square, and if there were any stores there. And I remember there was a store there. A Jewish guy owned it. That was a perfume shop, and we always had to. But particularly when I was about 3-4, we always had to stop there and smell the smells. I had to. My mother said I insisted to stop and smell all the scents.
Can you describe your home, your childhood home?
Oh, it was really very nice. I mean, what I remember is this apartment, and we had really nice furniture. It was custom-made furniture. My father had his own ideas about what furniture should look like.
So what did it look like?
We had one was which was like a library furniture, but it wasn't. It was also a room with a round table, a really large round table which you could use for eating or for whatever, but they usually had, friends over for, they played bridge, whatever. And it also had a sofa bed, which was a very interesting one. It was a sofa bed, the back was floor to ceiling. It was the length of a little bit longer than a regular bed. It had 3 large cushions, about this size. That was a bookshelf. There was bookshelves closed with glass. It had some really beautiful armchairs, and we had. Some of the carpets that I have still come from my grandparents' place. Okay, and I think I remember. Maybe I still remember which ones. Particularly the smaller ones that are on the hallway upstairs. So what happened is that piece we took. That's the only piece of furniture we took to South America, and it was that. Oh, and it also had an extension, which was one of those bookcase secretaries where you could flip the thing down and it made a really nice desk. And you could separate it into 2. It was constructed in such a way that it could be modular. So we took those to South America with us, and that became the furniture in my room. I slept on that one. It was when you removed the back cushions, because they had the back cushions, when you removed it, it was the size of almost a double bed.
How many rooms did you have in the house?
In the house we had 3. We had a kitchen. The kitchen had been a maid's room originally, destined to be. There was also a pantry, which was a large pantry next to it. And then, as in many houses, the toilet was separate from the bathroom. And there was a dining room. There was one room, there was a dining room. It also had some beautiful furniture. You could really open it up, seat 12 or more people around it. The chairs were upholstered in burgundy. My father loved burgundy. He hated gold. He liked silver and blue and blues and burgundies. That was his favorite colors. And I know that the bed they had was also a custom-made bed. It was that kind of, but it also was a double bed, but each side was, again, much bigger than your average bed. I can't tell you exactly what it was. Nice night tables. It had it had a big armoire, huge, and it had a tall lip. So in the winter time, my mother used to get russet apples. And here you guide them and they're this size and they're, crummy little apples. They don't taste like anything, but these are big like that, and you had them. And she used to put newspaper layers and fill it with apples. There was also a cellar. The apartment was rented, but the cellar stayed with us. The downstairs was rented, but the cellar stayed with us, and one was a wash house, what they call the wash house. And there was also a chicken coop there. My mother sometimes kept chicken in it and so on, took to the shochet for slaughtering. And if there wasn't a shochet occasionally after the war, then she would just take care of them herself. And the other part was a true cellar. It had wood. And of course the heating was the ceramic things, and then after the war we got gas, natural gas. So it was converted to gas. They were converted to gas, and that was fabulous because you didn't have to worry about wood, right? So, but there was always enough sand, and it was, that part of the floor was beaten, it wasn't cement. Where the wash house was, there was, it was cement, and it had a drain in the middle of it, so you could wash it. My mother kept some rabbits at one point in cages there, and we used the Angora, I had it spun, and I had a sweater knit out of that, and I had somebody knit a sweater for me from a peach-colored, fine English woolen yarn. And there was some left of that, and there was the Angora that had been spun, and I knitted myself a sweater that was peach to here and Angora up to there. And you always had Angora pieces in your mouth from those early ones.
What did you keep in the cellar? Did you keep
we
root
kept
vegetables?
Potatoes and carrots in the winter time, and there were barrels of sauerkraut that my mother made.
Well, you mentioned that you had 3 rooms. You mean 3 bedrooms?
No, 1 bedroom, and I think I slept on a sofa somewhere. I don't even remember where.
But not in their room, not in your parents'
No,
room?
not in my parents'
And
room.
there you had a dining room, so you had a bedroom, a dining room, and a
salon.
living room. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Did they have any domestic help, your parents?
My mother had somebody on and off. You know, she had a little country girl one time, which I have a story about this thing here, because that was I think in 37, 38, and I was running around, and there was this little country girl who was supposed to help her, which she was fine. She was about 15, 16, but she kept leaving the door to the upstairs open. By that time we had to divide into 2, and we were upstairs, and she left the door open, and my mother said, "Don't leave the door open, she's going to run down the stairs, and I'm afraid that she's going to fall and hurt herself." Well, I don't know because I don't remember. I was maybe 20 months old or something like that, and she said I wanted to have a drink, and I didn't want a drink, I just wanted to play with the water. And so she said, "No playing with the water." And whenever she looked, I drank, and whenever she didn't look, I played. So she caught me, and she said, "Give me that." And I took off, ran down the stairs, out to the street, out to the corner where I tripped, and the glass broke in my hand, and it cut, and I had a cut here, but there was a lot of blood. So she wrapped in a towel around this, went to the pediatrician, and he washed my hand, and he said, "Well, there is nothing I can see." By the time the blood had stopped, there's nothing I can see. And it was only 2 days later that was realized that I had a cut here. And one of these fibers, because this is all fibrous here, was cut. And so I could never open my fingers without really feeling the pull here. Then the other thing is I had something here which I insisted to help her to grind something, and I pushed it and I got a piece chopped off from my finger. That I remember because I was about 7. But she said, "Don't do it that way, take the wooden pusher." I didn't listen. So.
The girls that that helped your mother, did they live in? Or?
Yeah, she lived in. So I think there was a pull-out bed, and she slept in the kitchen.
In the kitchen. Mm-hmm. Any other helper, like to do the washing?
No,
cleaning?
she did the washing herself.
And shopping and cooking? Who did the shopping?
She
and
did
cooking?
the shopping and she did the cooking. And we had a really lovely table in the kitchen. Again, I think it was a custom-made table, which was folded, and it was a rectangular table. You could have daily meals there, and it wasn't built-in furniture, but it was a nice whatever. And you could open it completely, and on the inside you could use it as a pastry board. And I remember we used to pull, a phyllo dough on it. And whenever she did phyllo dough, we had to help her pull the phyllo dough. That I remember very well. Had to be very careful how you pulled it. Very carefully how you pulled the phyllo dough.
You mentioned that you had a bathroom and a separate toilet.
Yeah, the bathroom didn't have a toilet. It was a bathroom and a sink,
Yeah.
and the toilet was separate.
And so that means you had water. Did you have hot water inside?
Yes.
Okay.
And it had the bathroom had a huge the bathroom where the bathtub was had a huge tank.
Of heater, like a heater tank.
Yes, it had a heater. You heated it with wood in the winter time, and when we got gas, it was converted to gas, so it was much easier.
Before the war, or when you were little, how did you heat the apartment? Wood?
With those
And wood or
wood,
coal?
wood.
Okay.
No, the gas came in only after, because we were in a mountainous area and there's lots of rock and so on. There wasn't any gas pulled in before, but after the war, gas was pulled in around 46 or so. They pulled in gas, and so you could get these burners about this size and put them in, just pull in the thing, and we had to be very careful because they didn't have any. They sometimes put sulfhydra SH into this thing to give it some smell, so if there is a leak. So we were constantly warned not to touch the little taps, the safety taps that were behind the stoves, behind those ceramic things. The other place that has these things is in Switzerland.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, resuming.
Okay, we were talking about your home. I wanted to ask you, did you have books at home?
Oh, we had a lot of books. And I tell you what, I remember my mother always saying that in 1940, they had spent 2 days with my father burning books. Because my father was not a communist, he was a left-leaning actually a socialist. And there were some books that were deemed verboten. I still have some. I could show you the books. I still have all the books that my mother kept. But these are all books that are very neutral. So there were always lots of books. And lots of books.
What kind of books?
Some of them were political books. Some of them were in German, some of them were in Hungarian, some of them were eventually in Spanish, some English. Then when we got to South America and I went to a French school, then there were French books as well. And I remember my father telling me you should read Les Miserables, and I was 12 or 13, and I went to the library and I said, to the library at school, and I said, I want to borrow Les Miserables in French. And she said, oh, it's not for children. I said, but my father said I should read it. So she gave it, she lent it to me.
Did they read a lot, your parents?
Yes, a lot.
Both of them?
Both of them.
What is it that they mostly read?
You know what? All sorts of things. My father read novels, he read biographies, he read political stuff. He also read a set of books by a very interesting Romanian Jewish. I don't know exactly what his background was. His original name was Stefan Segler, but he ran under the name of Stefan Relgis. He sort of just turned the word around. You can find him online. He was a political analyst looking at USSR and China, looking at the left-leaning governments. And the interesting thing is that in the 50s, he actually forecast what now is happening with Russia and China. And so, that I remember because I was old enough, and I remember the conversation around our table. They ended up in Uruguay as well, and by some curious coincidence, they lived in the apartment next door to ours. And so my father became friends with him. He was about the same age as my father, and give or take, I don't know, maybe a little bit older, maybe a tiny bit younger, but same age group. Had a couple of children who were I don't know where. And I remember those conversations. They were always political conversations around the table. His family eventually in Europe was very closely linked to the Shomriya movement, to the Shomer HaTzair, and that's how two of his brothers ended up in Israel. One of them actually left because he got involved with the Irgun, and the Brits were after him. Not that he was participating in any of the kind of things that they were doing at the time, but the fact is that they were looking for all the Irgun every time the Irgun did something. So he ended up he said he left Europe because of whatever. He wasn't going to stand for it here. So he just went and took the first boat that landed him in New Zealand.
At home, as a child, did your parents read newspapers? In Romania, newspapers. Do you remember seeing newspapers at home?
My father always read the newspaper. He actually used the newspaper to learn languages. Newspapers, wherever he was, to learn languages.
And in Romania, what newspapers
he read? The local Romanian newspaper. He listened to the news on the radio, but he also spoke with a lot of people. One of the things is that somebody needed help. They always came, asking my father for help. He was always willing to help and do anything for anybody. And so when the chips were down, there was always somebody to help.
Okay.
Because there were lots of people who owed him things.
We'll talk about that later. What did you observe of religion at home? What was your religious observance?
My mother lit candles every Friday night. We kept all the holidays. I went to the Jewish day school.
At what age?
From age 6.
Okay, so that's after the war.
No, it was.
37, no, 43.
I started during the war. The school was closed, but somebody rented some rooms in an apartment building, and we had some classes there for a couple of years until the war was over. We were out of school for about 6 months when the school was closed, and that other location was closed as well towards the end of the war, when things got a little bit much more hairy. And we ended up, after that, sort of 1946, the school reopened. And so grade 4 was back in the old school.
Okay. You said that you did all the holidays at home. How often did you go to synagogue, your family?
My recollection is we went every holiday. We stayed home sometimes, but my mother had always apportioned us things to read before she left. And she said, you read this, 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 and this, and you have to prove that you read it when we come home.
When they went where?
They went to the synagogue.
On high holidays?
Yes, on high holidays. My father used to go every Shabbat, or almost every Shabbat. When we were in South America, he always went on Shabbat, and he always came back with somebody. We never knew who he was coming back with, but he always came back with somebody for lunch.
Did your family keep kosher in Romania?
Answer is no, because you ate what you got, what was available. So nobody paid too much attention, So Rabbi said you can do it because you need to eat. You get what you get.
Do you remember any special Shabbat activities that the family did on Saturdays?
I don't. We mostly read, actually, read books, took the opportunity to read. That was what we mostly did. Didn't do much else.
What was your favorite Jewish holiday as a kid? Like as a little kid, do you remember?
I don't. Maybe Pesach, because there were lots of people around the table. You know, there were lots of people. I mean, there were 4 of us, but, you know, we always had at least 10 around the table.
Who were the others, usually?
Well, were interesting people. Some of them were people who didn't have anywhere else to go. Some of them, a couple of them were mixed couples, where one of the partners was Jewish, the other one wasn't, but the children were being brought up as Jews. So they were invited on a regular basis. So they were, you know, so they were about us and maybe 2 or 3 other kids. And and I remember, you know, being drilled to say Manishtana when I was 5 years old. Then my mother put her foot down and she said, "You just must learn this one."
You were the one who had to say all
yeah,
the
well,
Manishtana?
yeah. By the time of my sister's turn would have come, if things fell apart. I mean, she learned subsequently, but you know, at that time I was 5, and she said, "It's time that you learn to ask the questions."
Did you just eat matzah during Pesach, or?
You know, we only ate matzah. My mother went and got, I mean, you know, wherever they were making matzah fresh, it's probably was shmura matzah. For sure, because, you know, I don't remember them being round, frankly, but I sort of remember them being very different from what we get now. That I do remember.
Who were your parents' friends in Romania when you were little? The social circles they moved
Well,
in?
mostly Jewish people, almost exclusively, except, you know, my father had a few non-Jewish friends. But it was because he had met these people through work, or because these were people who were probably known to be not anti-Semitic, really, and most of them were Romanian, or had some linkages to Romanian backgrounds.
What languages did you speak at home in the family?
My mother spoke Hungarian primarily. Once school started, we refused to speak Hungarian, we spoke Romanian. What I found is that my sister and I both ended up by speaking the prevalent language wherever we were. So when we were in South America, we ended up speaking together only Spanish. Once we came to Canada, we ended up by speaking to each other only English. My mother spoke to my oldest son for a while in Hungarian, and she just didn't speak Hungarian anymore. She just didn't want to speak Hungarian anymore. She spoke to the other 2 in English, and as a result, they don't know any Hungarian. Mark still remembers. I mean, he understands everything, but, you know.
And your parents to each other, they spoke Hungarian back in Romania?
Yeah, they spoke Hungarian.
And your mother never learned Romanian?
Oh, my mother learned Romanian, but her Romanian wasn't all that good. And I remember very well that when I was about 6, she was saying something to me in Romanian, and it was a bad grammar. And I said, "If you don't know a language, don't speak it." Kids, go figure. Oh, it's the same way as I told her we were going to my grandparents to visit them when she was, and I don't remember that. That's the story that she told. She kept telling. You know, she thought it was really hilarious, but she was pregnant with my sister, and she had quite a bit of morning sickness. Also, the smell of those coal engines, the trains, it was atrocious. So she went to the bathroom vomiting, and I said to her, "Nem szégyelled magadat, köpsz, mint egy cigány. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You're spitting like a gypsy." Because we had some gypsies that were nomadic, that were collecting berries and making their living by selling berries, and they would come around with drum on their backs, which where they carried this thing, and they would cough and spit, mostly because I think they chewed tobacco. But what did I know why they spit? Well, we had some issues when I lived in South America with the gypsies. We had a number of children who were sick, and they were kept in the hospital in perpetuity, even if they got better, because they needed special care, and they were just abandoned. And the hospital just kept them.
Back to your parents' social circles, you said that they were mostly Jewish, their friends.
Yes.
What kind of activities did they do with their friends? You mentioned playing bridge. What other things did they do with their friends, your parents?
You know what? My father and I used to go every Sunday when it was possible, and we walked up to there was one mountain. We went for a hike every Sunday, and usually we used to meet there with a whole bunch of people. And the routine is you got up at 6 o'clock and you walked up. And in the wintertime, you actually came down with a sled on the Serpentine. And we had potato soup for lunch there. There was a restaurant, and that's all we had, nothing else, potato soup. And come back. And in the summertime, you walked back down. My mother never came, and my sister never came, because my sister refused to walk, and she had to be carried. So,
were there these friends? Did they have children your age?
Yes,
were there
was a whole bunch of them. There were some girls. There was one girl whose parents, her name is Miriam Miralman, but I don't remember her parents at all. I just remember her. I called her Miri, and I didn't like that name. I didn't like the abbreviation. And there was a Hirsch family that we were friendly with, and they had two daughters. One of them was my age, and the other one was younger. Towards the end of the war, when we had some bombings, the Americans bombed this town. We had the cellar, so we went during the bombings in the cellar. But they didn't have, and I think something happened, and the younger daughter had a shrapnel that sliced a piece of her skull, and it was removed. I mean, she was fine after, but you could see for a while her hair grew back. Now they can do those surgeries without cutting out the hair or whatever, but she actually had a big thing, and you could see the vessels beating underneath it. So she had to get her head covered with something. I don't even remember what it was. I think it was a scarf only, because there were no helmets to be had. But she had to keep her head covered.
Do you remember experiencing any anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic incidents in Romania?
Well, what I remember is I don't remember any other ones, except we used to walk. My father used to walk me as far as his store, and then his partner, Adler's partner's son, and I would walk together. And there were some of the boys who were there were also a lot of Saxons in this town, and some of them would come out and beat him up on a regular basis. And when the war was over, and we were told that we were not allowed to respond to anything that came from the other side, from one side of our neighbors, because they were Sasuk and they're anti-Semitic. And they used to shout stuff, but I don't remember exactly what they used to shout, but I suspect the children, but I suspect that they were anti-Semitic things, which is why we were told not to answer. And luckily there was a wooden fence, which was tall enough, that, nobody could climb over it. There was an apartment building to the back of us where about half the population was Jewish. So that was okay. And I think there was a couple there who was childless who were friends of my parents, and they got together once in a while when they were playing cards. And then, there were all these kids that we used to play with and, ride bicycles with bicycles. I mean, we didn't have any bicycles, but the boys across the street, the parents had siblings who had no children, so they were spoiled rotten, and they had, even through the war, had all sorts of things that we didn't have because that's what they spent, whatever extra bit of money they had. They got it together, and these boys had bicycles, and they had whatever. And we had a scooter, one of those that you just go by, which was fine. Didn't have a bicycle, and I remember one time I used to use the boys' bicycle and was bicycling down the hill, and our piano teacher came, and she said, "You shouldn't be running a bicycle. What are you going to do if you run a bicycle? You're going to break your fingers, and then how are you going to play the piano?" What a bad idea.
When the Antonescu regime took over in 1940 and the Iron Guard, what kind of change? You already mentioned that the store had to be under.
Yeah, the store had to be under. My father was periodically absent. They were looking for him because what they did is they sort of conscripted men to sort of do road works. And, he was about 172 centimeters tall and very small boned guy, not necessarily used to doing heavy physical work. Although he had been active in the sense that he was a big walker, he was always a big walker. And he always walked instead of taking any transportation wherever he could all his life. And he was a big fan for toughening us up. So you can't say you can't do that. You have to walk. Just walk. But my sister said she couldn't walk, so she didn't walk, and she just didn't walk. But she didn't want to walk.
So your father, even though he was in good shape, he didn't want to go do road work, I guess, forced labor.
No, he didn't want to go to road works. I think he probably took advantage of all of the people that he knew from his employment to hide him for periods of time. That's how we ended up in the village where we ended up. At the time that things got really quite bad, because it was not so bad that we were directly threatened, but it looked like we were going to be threatened. So he felt that it was a wise thing to get out of there and be hidden. Frankly, that's what he thought. And he wasn't there. He was hiding somewhere else. So...
When did you go into hiding?
It was 44 to 45. I think, I don't exactly remember, but it was towards the end of the war when actually the Germans started to come closer to, just before sort of they got beaten up, and last few months of war, because they were doing funny stuff and getting into areas that they never got before, and in areas that were not up to them to get into, because it was not part of where they had been until then, but then they just came in there. Although there had been some trouble in Bucharest and some other places like that, but it wasn't all that bad. I mean, there was problem in the northern provinces like Bukovina and Moldova and places like that.
Well, they were taking Jews to
Transnistria. Yeah, they were taking
Jews
from there to concentration camp. But in fact, there was not that much of a, where we were, there wasn't that much of a problem. But he just felt, I knew there were some things that had happened that a lot of the Jews were running out of town. So basically anybody who was able to got out of town and went into hiding somewhere, different places. And my father tried different places until he found this guy willing to take us. In those places he all knew, but they were not willing to take anybody.
Well, you said that there were things that were happening that
yeah, I'm not
like
even sure exactly
kind?
what it was happening, but there was sort of a total panic, and I remember that everybody was in a panic about something. Don't ask me what it was, but it was a total panic in town, and people just ran. And I remember that confusion, people running. That I remember very clearly, but I couldn't tell you what it was. All I can tell you is that I remember that for the longest time there were noises and funny things that I used to jump so badly that my mother was actually worried. And then gradually as I got older, like in my teens, gradually that kind of disappeared. But sudden sharp and unexpected noises, not so much my sister, but although she was too, but particularly it used to get me jumping in a really bad way.
Before you went into hiding towards the end of the war, after 1940, in what ways could you see, in what ways did your life change? Yes, the shop, your house being divided.
Yeah,
what other changes were there? I was going to Montessori school that was in German, and kindergarten, and then we weren't allowed to go there anymore because all the Jewish kids were kicked out. But 3/4 of the class was Jewish kids, by the way, in that Montessori kindergarten. Do you have any memories of this Montessori kindergarten?
Yes, I do.
What are your memories?
Yeah,
before we go on?
Yeah, I remember being there, and I think one time we went to a movie with this group in the class, and it was, I think, Pinocchio or something. It was the early cartoons. That was the first time I went to a movie, right? And then my mother had put this kindergarten in the house.
After you were kicked out of Montessori?
Yeah, after, and all of the Jewish kids who were there. I actually have pictures of that one. I do have pictures of the Montessori kindergarten, and with my apron and a big bow on top of my head.
What else do you remember of that kindergarten in your home?
Oh, all I remember is that we had a lot of fun.
But it wasn't a big house, you said, so where did she put all these kids?
They put it in that salon. It was, she pushed everything aside, and there was enough room in that salon to have, I think there were maybe 12, 15 children there.
Who fed all these children?
I don't remember. I mean, they weren't fed, it was only half day, right? And they were all in the neighborhood, so they went home after the half day. But my mother was there, and there was somebody there. I don't know who else was there. But maybe another mother who was, but I just don't remember. And those were the kids who were usually at the birthdays, and the Peter was there, and my cousin wasn't there because they lived in another part of town. But
do you remember what activities your mother did with you guys? I don't remember.
We had a lot of songs, and my mother, God bless her, she wrote down all the songs we ever learned in school or otherwise. I have them all, and I know them all. I still know them all.
Was this all in Hungarian?
No, a lot of them in German, some of them in Hungarian. A lot of the Hungarian songs are the ones that she used to sing.
Did the other parents pay her?
Pardon? No.
Did the other parents pay? No, so it was
no,
all
this was
voluntary.
free. No. People couldn't afford it after that either, because a lot of people got kicked out of jobs, or they did whatever.
How long was this going on, this kindergarten?
This one, home? I think for a good year it was.
And after that?
And after that, I think we went to the Jewish day school for 1 year. So I was about 4.5, 5.5, something like that, to 5.5, something like that. And I have the picture, actually. and that's what it was.
Do you remember restrictions in daily life, let's say, for example, food restrictions or ration
Well, I
cards?
remember we had coupons. I mean, you had coupons. You know, you really had coupons. You had only, that's what you could get. And my father used to manage to get a goose from time to time. I don't know how he managed to get a goose from time to time. So that was that. But at some point in time, he couldn't get any more geese. And so we ended up by having bacon. And my mother was very reluctant. And so.
What kind of food stuff was bought on coupon?
Pardon?
What kind of food stuff was bought on coupon on ration cards?
Bread mostly, milk was on rations. Anything, almost everything was on ration cards. Meat was on ration cards. Meat was scarce anyway. Vegetables were not bad because there was always the market, and on the market there was no ration cards. So vegetables, fruit, and that there was whatever there was, and you could buy that. The geese, I don't know how my father managed to buy them, but he bought them probably on the black market. Who knows? Don't ask me. I don't know.
Did your house have any kind of a garden where you could grow vegetables?
Yes, we had a garden. It was a nice garden. My mother did grow some stuff there as well, at least for a while, until there were bombings, and then you couldn't do it anymore because it was full of ashes and soot and garbage, and there was a crater about a block away from our house from a bomb that misfired. It was a small bomb, fortunately, but there was a lot of. But the roof caved in from the earth that got thrown on the roof. So I remember that one of the lamps that we had in the dining room actually just collapsed and fell and scattered and crashed into pieces because of the water that seeped through the roof into the house until the roof was somehow repaired.
Were there any restrictions specifically for Jews, for example, different curfew for Jews as non-Jews?
I think there was, but I don't remember because I was too young, I wouldn't have been out at the time but I think there was a curfew, for sure. Because people were reluctant to, and I think you couldn't go into cinemas or whatever, something like that. That vaguely I remember.
You mean Jews couldn't?
Yeah.
But you could still go to school?
Pardon?
You could still go to school, to your own Jewish school?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether they kicked out kids from public schools, the Romanian schools, because some of the Romanians were quite decent. Some of them were not, but some of them were quite decent. And my mother always tells the story that at a point in time there was no bread, and she was looking for bread, and she didn't have any rations. That's when we were, at the time that there was that panic, and nobody, she tried to get the bread, and nobody wanted to even sell her a bread. And so this Romanian woman came, and she said, "You want bread? Here it is, don't pay me." So she always remembers that. She always told that story.
Did you always have enough food to eat?
I don't remember being hungry.
And do you remember certain foodstuffs you said that there was a shortage of meat, but do you remember that certain things were not cooked or made or were not available that you had been used to?
Sometimes you couldn't get bread, but then my mother used to make bread. My father also procured some flour, brown flour. So she used to make it, and what they used to do to make the flour rise better, they mixed potatoes in the bread. So you had to do it almost every day because it doesn't last. We didn't have a fridge. Some people did. We didn't. So my mother used to go to the candy factory and buy a chunk of ice, put it in a bucket, and then cover it with paper, and then just put everything that needed to be kept overnight in there. It kept very well, I must say. It did keep very well.
You mentioned about bombings, and going down to the cellar. When did the war kind of come to your town in that sense?
45.
So
44, 45.
Towards the end.
Towards the end, yes. And I think, there were some targets that they were bombing, but they had quite a few misfires. And so that's why some people got injured and some things got, destroyed in town because of the misfires. One of the problems is that there was a mountain or a hill close to home that was walking distance, which is not the one that my father and I used to go hiking to. And we used to go there in the summertime to pick wildflowers before and so on, before the war. And that I remember, and they had lots of snowdrops on that mountainside. But it also had an old castle that became a German garrison. And so they were trying to bomb it, and it misfired. And it was so close that it fell on the corner of our street. And so that's where there were some problems with some of the houses. The castle didn't get damaged, which in a way, in hindsight, is just as well, because it's one of the old medieval castles, by the way, that existed in town. So.
Did you come across soldiers in town?
Pardon?
Did you come across soldiers?
Well,
army?
we used to see them, but we kept very close to home most of the time, and so I never saw soldiers. Never saw soldiers until the Russians came into town, which was a completely different thing. It was every bit as hairy for a long time, because they requisitioned rooms and whatever. So we got.
We'll talk about that. There are two stories that you mentioned. One was when your father went to Bucharest for a visa.
Yeah,
Tell me about that.
My father had applied for. So what happened is that my uncle, who ended up in New Zealand, my father had always wanted to leave Europe. Even his father had wanted to leave Europe, and somehow it just never came around. And when this brother ended up in ended up in New Zealand, he sent him an immigration permit to New Zealand. What happened is that one of his brothers was a student, and he was part of the student agitations of some kind, and he wound up in jail. And when he got out, actually, most of these kids who were arrested in Budapest at university were Jewish kids, because they were part of the socialist movement. And so the Jewish community got together and got them to the local youth to go and visit them and take them food. And so he met this girl, and he married her when he got out of jail. And it's at that time that my father had this immigration permit. And they were looking for him, even though he'd been out of jail. So my father said, take my permit and you go to New Zealand. So he missed out on that one. Then he decided that at one point that he wanted to go to Canada. And when the war started, actually, he decided even more that he wanted to go to Canada. And so he applied for a visa. And at that point in time, he was financially quite solvent, which meant that, he wasn't going to be a burden to the Canadian government because he was not sponsored, and he had enough money to keep himself for long enough until whatever. And so he was approved, and he had to go and pick up his visa. And he had to go to Bucharest to pick up the visa and sign some papers. So he went to Bucharest, signed the papers, and they said, you have to come back in a week, because they had to do I don't know what. And he was staying in a hotel in the Jewish quarter, and I said, not going to, after he was there for a day, he said, what am I going to do here? I've been in Bucharest so many times, there's nothing I can, nothing I want to do here. I just want to go home. So he said, I could come back in a week's time. And he left, and that night, the Jews were rounded up and ghettoized in Bucharest. And there was a lot of it. It was like a pseudo-Kristallnacht really happening in Bucharest.
You're talking about the January 1941 pogrom of Bucharest.
Probably. So he came home, and that was the end of it. And at the end of the war, we left. And we were in South America for about 2 or 3 years already. And this big envelope arrives with all the immigration papers to Canada. And it was still the old kind of thing. Never mind that it had stamps from all over the world, but it also still had wax stamps. Can you imagine? From 1941, they still were using the wax stamps. And it had gone to Australia, it had gone to New Zealand, it had gone, you name it. And it arrived there, and my father looked at it and he said, and I remember that, because I was 11 or so, and he said, I'm not going anywhere, I've had it. So we didn't go. But after a few years, he decided that I had to come to Canada, because I speak French and because whatever. I didn't intend to come to Canada, actually. My intention was to go to Israel, frankly, to finish medicine and to get out of Uruguay and go, not because of anti-Semitism, but because I just didn't like the place. And I wanted to leave, and so I was going to go to, there was no anti-Semitism to speak of at the time. Or if there was, it was very quiet. And, I moved in Jewish circles. I belonged to the Jewish Student Union and whatever, and belonged to the synagogue youth and whatever. And it was, we weren't whatever. But I was going to go, and that was the end of it. And just circumstances happened so that I ended up here anyway.
We'll talk about that. Another story I wanted to remind you to tell me is once when they were looking for your father and your mother dressed up in like a scarf.
Oh, well, they were looking for, because they were rounding up all the Jews in town, and my mother got into the habit of walking with a stride behind like the country women babushkas. And they said they wanted to look for Mr. Strussel or whatever, Ignat Strussel. And they said, and my mother said, do I know who it is? That's just working here. I don't know who he is. I don't know where he is. How would I know? Just working here. Nobody tells me anything. So they never came back. And I don't know how she had the guts, because as far as we're concerned, she was a bit of a chicken, but she got all the courage that she could pull together to say, no.
Where did you go into hiding? You never mentioned the name of the village.
It was a town that's called Tatrang. A nice big village, and this farmer was quite wealthy, and we stayed with him. His house was quite lovely, and he had one room that he gave us. It was not exactly a bedroom, but there was enough accommodation with sofas that pulled out, almost pull-out sofas with sofa beds type arrangements, and we slept there, my mother and my sister, and we were not supposed to get out of the compound. Those were interesting compounds, because most of the village compounds in Europe are a compound. You have a gate in the front, and one side you have a house, and then on the other side you have a summer kitchen, and then you have a dung pile, and then on the left-hand side you have the barn, and upstairs you have the hay loft, and then you have the downstairs is the cows and the pigs and the whatever. And then in the back you have a garden, and there is a gate, and it goes out into the field.
So that was your compound.
And that was our compound. And so, it was big enough. We weren't really tempted to go out beyond into the street part. which is the part that we were told we weren't allowed to go out. Well, we weren't told, but every time we were out of the house, Mother always, I remember her always wanting to know where we went and where we had been. Because it was not, she didn't want us to go out of the compound.
Do you remember the name of this farmer family?
No. But I remember when they were cooking, the little potatoes that were left after the harvest, they used to take those little ones that are not good, but like this size, and cook them with whey from the thing and feed that to the pigs. And the kids used to go and eat some of the potatoes that were cooked in whey.
What did you do all day?
I don't remember. I think we were just horsing around, frankly. We did nothing. We didn't read, we did nothing.
And your mother?
And I don't know. She was mostly in the house.
Did they have any kids your age?
Yes, they had. They were older. They had one little boy that was our age. And we played with him. And he was not allowed to go past the barn, so it was fairly safe that we wouldn't be wandering about.
This was a Romanian. These were Romanian?
No, it was a Hungarian family. Tatrang was in Transylvania, but it was basically a Hungarian village. Contrary to some of the villages further northeast, that were, a lot of them were mainly Romanian ones. Like Dij was a mainly Romanian town, and Cetan was a mainly Romanian village.
Did other people in the village know that there was a Jewish family there?
I don't know. I have no idea. Frankly, I wouldn't have known. Because very little was shared. There was a lot of things that I knew because I was a little bit older, and when I got a little bit older, they chased me out of the room to not listen, I would still go and eavesdrop. And so I heard things, but what I didn't hear, I couldn't tell you.
What are the things that you did hear?
Well, for example, I know that not from that time, but I used to hear what when people who came back from concentration camp were telling stories to my parents. And those are the sorts of things that I actually heard. And that's how I know that, for instance, my aunt and my cousin died almost 2 days before liberation, and they survived typhus in Bergen-Belsen and so on and so forth. And there were, two groups of women from a couple of camps that were put on boats and blown up in Lithuania from Riga. And curiously enough, my cousin, when he was here in this fall, in November, he said that those were not the only two ships, that he knows that there were more, but he doesn't know which ones they were. But they were more of those sorts of things that the Germans did, loaded people at the last minute and blew them up. I mean, that I know. And I never even doubted that, because I heard it. And I heard the story that that was one of my mother's cousins, and her sister said to her, if I don't survive, they happened to be together with their daughters, who were young teenagers, and said, if I don't survive, you look after my daughter, she's yours, I give her to you. And the vice versa, she told her sister that if I don't survive, then. And so one of them didn't survive, so she had two daughters in the end, teenagers that she was bringing up at the end of the war. By this time they were finishing off high school and so on and so forth. And so I heard that one. I also heard stories about my uncle, William, when people were coming back, and he said, Mrs. Strussel, do you know where your brother is? I want to thank him. He saved my life. How did he save your life? Well, I said, I don't know how he saved my life, but I had this acute appendicitis, and I mean, this guy was a gynecologist, right? And he didn't like to do surgery. Anytime surgery had to be done, he asked somebody else. But he knew how to do it, but he just didn't like to do it. And he said, "You saved my life." And he said, "I don't know," but he seemed to have a supply of dollar bills that he used to bribe the guards with for medicines and supplies, and he did an appendectomy, and I was fine. So,
All these stories after the war.
these were the stories that came back. I mean, my husband didn't speak that much about his, but he dropped enough things that I could link some things together.
We'll talk about his story because you said you wanted to kind of give a gist of that. But going back to when you were hiding in a village, did you ever see your father in those months?
No, I didn't see my father in that. It's only when we got back home that he was there.
Do you know if he paid this farmer family?
I expect he may have, but I don't know. This was a time that, you know, we had, I mean, some money, and I'm sure that he sort of paid off somebody. That's for sure, because, you know. But the fact is that he was willing to do it, because not everybody was willing to do it, paid off or not paid off. So.
Were there any close calls that you remember when you were there?
I don't remember. I think this was more, frankly, I think this was more of a precautionary thing, because it was like a situation where you didn't know where this war was going as it came closer to our town, and that's when the panic ensued, and people had already heard all the stories that were percolating from the different places. And so we, you know, suddenly there was this panic in the Jewish community that happened, and people were running all over the place looking for places to go. And I know that we went to 2 or 3 places before we finally ended up there. They were not willing to keep us. You can stay for a day, no more.
Do you remember like this journey from Brasov to these places and then to this village?
Very vaguely, but I remember that eventually we ended up there. We didn't go back to Brasov during this going from places. We ended up there. We ended up in that village, and then I no longer saw we no longer our father until.
How did you travel? On a horse and buggy, or?
I don't remember. There were, I think, a bus that was taking a load of people. I think there was. And it wasn't horse and buggy. That's for sure. Not by private car either. We didn't have a car. Very few people had cars. So I'm not sure.
How were you treated by this family?
Fine. We didn't have any complaints. You know, they treated us like their kids, as kids. You know, I don't know whether there was any problem with my mother, but I don't recall. I don't think there was any problem. She kept much to herself, so it wouldn't have been too much of a problem in any event. But they didn't, you know, they didn't treat us differently than their own children.
Did you kind of participate in the family life? Would you eat together with them?
No, we didn't eat together with them. No, we ate with mother, but when, you know, they were cooking the way with the potatoes, and the kids used to come, and we used to participate in that one. And yes, I think I remember at Christmas time they had the salon cukor, you know, the candies, yeah. That they're homemade candies, and we had some of those. That's how I remember the salon cukor.
Do you remember?
Actually, my mother knew how to make it.
Do you remember observing any of the Jewish holidays while you were there in the village?
No, we didn't. We didn't keep anything.
Did you have a false name or any kind of false identity for the rest of the world?
I don't think so.
And you didn't go to church with them?
No, we didn't go to church with them. No, we stayed put. Mm-hmm. I don't think they went much to church either, frankly, that family. So I don't think that they were Catholic or anything like that. They may have been some Batista. I don't know, Baptist or something. But I don't recall them going to church on Sunday at all, because I would have known.
You were there during the winter, right? Like, do you remember what season you arrived and what season you left?
No, I don't. I think it wasn't. I think it was towards the end of the winter into the fall. Because I think when we got back to Brasov, we went back to school.
So you were really, it's more like 45 then.
Yeah, it was more like 45 than 44. And that's when things got really kind of hairy and we didn't know what was going to happen because there were I think there were these stories of revenge from the Germans circulating already. And so there was a concern that there would be something like that happening, and that's where the panic must have arisen. That's only what I suppose in hindsight, but I'm not sure, so I can't tell you, because I was still fairly young, right? I was
Absolutely.
8, 9, and you just don't analyze, and you look back. I mean, I know some things that I did because I was a stubborn kid, like for instance, in school, in grade 1 we had a teacher. It was always difficult, as in many Jewish schools in those days, and even now sometimes, to get good teachers for the Jewish schools, and particularly for Hebrew and the like. And we had a teacher who was somehow related to my father. That's how we managed to get him. And he had 3 classes of citizens. There were boys who went to Cheder, there were boys who didn't go to Cheder, and then there were the girls. And he would the girls only allowed to learn them to read. He taught the boys who didn't go to Cheder some vocabulary and to read and to read and write. And then there was the boys who went to Cheder, who he taught all sorts of other things. He also taught in the afternoon at the Cheder. And I had a reputation for not sitting still. So I would scribble under the bench, and nobody knew what I was doing, scribbling under the bench, and I was learning to write, and I was learning the vocabulary. And then I had to watch him, because I didn't want to get into trouble. If I would have been smart enough, I would have told my father, but he would have gotten into a lot of trouble. But
that was Baruch, right?
Baruch
the Bocher.
Yeah, we called him the Burach.
Burach.
The Burach.
When you went back, finally, after the war, in what state did you find your house, your apartment?
The house was okay, it got cleaned, had to be cleaned up, but we cleaned it up and we stayed in the house.
Nothing was stolen?
Nothing was stolen. The Russians were coming into town and they were requisitioning rooms, and there were lots of very bad stories coming around.
What kind of stories did you hear?
Oh, that they came, the soldiers were coming in drunk, and they used to shoot things, and they used to shoot things in the pianos, and they used to do all sorts of untoward things. We were very lucky. We got a room requisitioned. That was the salon that we had. We had a family where he was the phys ed teacher, Kulturnik for the regiment that was there. She was the head nurse, and they were more than decent people. They had a little girl. She had she had run away. Well, her father sent her away from home when the allyship between Russia and Germany broke apart, because Russia invaded them. And she was 14 years old, and there were stories of the Germans raping the girls. And she said, you run away and you go with the partisans. So she ran away, because the rest of the siblings, she was a country girl, the rest of the siblings were all boys. So they were safe in that respect. So she ran away and she went with the partisans, and they put her through school, and she became a nurse. She met this guy somewhere in the army. The army hired her. She met him in the army. They got married. They had this baby. And she didn't know how to keep house. So he said to my mother, so he said that he was Jewish, but shh. His wife knows he's Jewish, but it's not mentioned. she was a very nice woman, very, very nice woman, very sweet. And she was the one who told the story to my mother, and he said, can you teach my wife, because she wants to learn how to cook and how to keep house. And he said, I'll teach you Russian in exchange.
Your mother, to teach your mother Russian, or to
No,
you?
teach us kids Russian in exchange. So he taught us Russian. I don't know how much my sister learned, how much she remembers, but I ended up by being able to write Cyrillic alphabet I forgot. Much as I used to be able to read, to write Gothic alphabet. I still can write Ein I in Gothic. That's about all I remember. But that's, and we had a fair vocabulary. I don't remember anything anymore. I can count to 10 and another 2 or 3 words, including Durak, and that's it. You know, I don't remember anymore because there was just not enough to fix enough of it to remember more than that. The German I should have remembered more. Vocabulary is not a problem, but the Gothic writing you forget because you end up by not using it. It's no longer used currently, not even in Germany.
What language did you speak with this couple, you and your mother? They were Russian?
They were Russian. You know what? She learned a smattering of Hungarian while she was there, and they were able to communicate a lot with gestures, but some words. It's like I always say, I speak Italian with a few words and a lot of hands and feet. Okay?
Did they stay there the whole time you were?
They stayed there for a couple of years. Well, they stayed there for a year at least, and then they were transferred because they weren't keeping people for a long time because they didn't want them to get too friendly with the locals, because they didn't like that notion. They couldn't be rough enough. They brought in another woman who was part of their so-called nursing staff, who turned out to be a pack of trouble. She was a drunk. She had a baby who was a illegitimate child. When the baby was 8 days old when they brought her in, when the couple left and she came in, she used to wash her dishes in the bathtub, which was water left for washing people and clothes, because we had shortage of water. They would shut down the water from time to time. She was rude. She would come home drunk and bring all kinds of not Russian soldiers into the house. Anybody and everybody she would pick up on the street. And my mother said, after about 3 months, she said, I've had it. I can't take it. She threatened her once with a knife. Then my mother said, that's it. You can go to the prefectura and complain about her, or I'll go to the prefectura and complain about her. So my father, who didn't want to cause any problems with the Russians, ended up by going and filing a complaint. They came to investigate, and they found 3 men and her drinking and the baby. She threatened, and I'll tell you why she threatened my mother. So she was gone within an hour. And they brought in the next head nurse, who was a single young woman, best friend from the couple before, and she was a pleasure to have around. She spoke a few words of Romanian so we could communicate. It was fine.
How did your parents restart life, the shop, and make money when you came back after the war?
Well, my father picked up. The Romanian fellow was paid out. He left the business, and it was the 2 of them running the business for a while. And they got into trouble because they called them speculators, and there was sort of a lawsuit whatever. But anyway, they got exonerated, so the business was, shortly before we left, the business was closed. Adler went back to doing tailoring or whatever, and they may have left shortly after to go to Israel, was still Palestine, and then we left to South America. Well, we didn't leave to South America directly. We were in France for from August to December.
August 46 to December 46.
Yeah.
Did your father sell the business? So he had some money from it?
No, he just sold the business. He just sold out whatever he had, whatever merchandise they had, they sold it out.
Why did your family decide to leave at that particular point?
Well, because it was, because as a businessman, they, at this point, a businessman, he hadn't been practicing accounting for a while. He was basically a businessman through the war, and that's what he made his living with. And, they called him a speculator. They tried to take him to court. It was kind of, I don't know how they fixed that one up, but I know that for a while he was away from home at that time as well, to try and figure these things out. Somebody said, my mother said he's in a hospital, but I don't know whether he was in a hospital. I think, they tried to take him to court, and he got so upset that his blood pressure shot up, and there wasn't much medication at the time, and so they stuck him in the hospital, and so the case was dropped. But he had no way of making a living with business. And so he said he was leaving, but we had quite a bit of saving. It's okay.
Stop.
You want to stop it?
Just
no.
stop until it stops.
The phone is...
Why did your family choose South America?
Because my mother's siblings were there. The story is a little bit more complicated. It is because my father, at the same time, we had an affidavit for going to Palestine. And the reason why we had it is because his brother, who was there, one of the two who went in 1935 and stayed, was about 17 or 18 years younger. He actually declared my father as his father, and they would allow him to bring in his siblings and his father into the country. What happened, though, is that it was Cyprus time, when people were clandestine migration and going into Cyprus. And he was actually concerned because there were some people who also had legitimate migration permits, ended up in Cyprus interned anyway. So he didn't want that. He said that's not for him. He cannot take that one. He just doesn't want it. So we chose South America, where we had also an immigration permit.
How was it easy to get out of the country in 1946?
No, you had to have an exit permit, an exit visa, and that involved some amount of bribery. It so happened that the secretary of the local Communist Party was a relative of some kind. Don't ask me what, because in these very large families you always have a relative somewhere. She was getting married. My father paid her 50 Napoleons, gold Napoleons, and our dining room set. And she managed to get us an exit visa.
And with that you could leave legally?
We could leave.
So why did you end up in France?
Because you had to go to France to get anywhere for a passage. It was the routine. People from Europe wound up in France when they wanted to go to the Americas.
How did you go from Romania to France?
Even people wanting to go other places from Europe ended up in France, ended up in different places. We ended up in Marseille, which was actually very fortunate, because people who ended up in Paris or other places had to leave from Le Havre, and the passage from Le Havre was even worse. They ended up by waiting 9 months or even a year sometimes to get out from Paris.
How did you go from Romania to France?
By ship.
By ship?
By ship.
On the Mediterranean?
Yeah, we went by train to Constanza, and from Constanza by ship to Marseille.
And was it all organized ahead of time that you're going to stay in Marseille?
Well, the Joint Commission was functional, and you actually had to pay them if you could afford to. So my father had to pay them, and they made the arrangements. And so we stayed at a hotel downtown in Marseille for about a week, and then they sent us out to the suburbs to a place that's called Sainte-Anne, Faubourg Sainte-Anne. If Faubourg Sainte-Anne was a lovely little place, it was just a lovely little place. And there was a Russian Jewish couple there who owned a pension de famille, and they were renting rooms to was one of the places, and this was one of the better places, and it sort of all was contingent to where you could pay these people. So my father had a little bit of savings, and so we used that one, and so we had one room first, and we had a communal bath, because they had two rooms that were very large, and had a toilet, a sink, and a bidet in it, so you could have a private bath. Actually, we never had a bath because they didn't have hot water, so it was always cold. It was winter time and it was cold water. It was fall and winter and the water was cold, and my father said, "Never mind, meg fogsz egyezni." Yeah. So we washed hair in cold water. Well, mother, I think, boiled some water for hair washing, but that was and then added cold water, and it was lukewarm water, and so we had our sort of hair washed that way, and it was long hair. I still have two pigtails, both mine and my sister's.
What did your parents do for those 6 months in Marseille?
Nothing. My father was reading newspapers. He learned French that way, and he brought me a book at one point, and he said, I knew a few words of French because we had somebody who came back from concentration camp. He was from Czernowitz originally. He had been a university prof, but he couldn't get a job, and so he was teaching privately French. But that didn't give him enough of a living. So my mother discovered one time that he was carrying boiled cold potatoes in his pocket for a snack or for food, for all the food he could afford. So she would, I don't know what she did, but she cooked for him a few meals and gave them to him while he was teaching us.
That was still back in Romania.
Back in Romania. And so we ended up in one of the large rooms it was an old mansion that they lived in, one part that was converted into a small apartment, and they were renting the rest. That's what they were making their living from, because they had been refugees out of Russia. They had managed to get out of Russia, without any sponsorship or anything. How they did it was their business, but they did it.
And you stayed in that
and
place
we stayed there. We stayed for a while in the smaller room, which had which you had to use the communal bath, which was a pain. I remember that, and we were so happy when we got into the other room because it was bright and big windows and really large and beautiful, and it was actually warmer than the other ones, the other place.
How was the eating done?
Oh, there was meals included. There was meals included. There was, they did a lot of what my mother used to call glingri, which is really hash meat, because that's what they got. Because otherwise they would have had to buy, totally unkosher food, and so they did that, and leek and salads and whatever they could lay their hands on, because there wasn't, variety wasn't that abundant, but they did their best, and the cooking wasn't bad at all, and it was made up as meat pies with potatoes, and it was quite tasty actually.
Were they Jewish also?
He was Jewish, she was not, but she was quite a good cook. I think they had somebody cooking for them. Frankly, yeah, they had somebody cooking and cleaning for them. So that was part of the deal,
Who were the other guests? Were they Jews?
There were also transient people. I don't remember them well because they were there sometimes for very short periods of time. That's how we managed to get into the bigger rooms, and some of them for longer periods of time. I'm not sure. My father used to talk to them, but we just played with the kids if we played with the kids, you know. And so my father bought this book in French, and I was sort of just short of 10. And it was translated, this book that's called Three Men in a Boat, translated into French. And he said, you read this book. And why he picked that one up, I don't know. It caught his eye when he went to the bookstore. Because he was trying to find a book, and I don't know, he must have asked whoever was in the bookstore. So they took that one, and I said, but I don't understand French and I don't have a dictionary. They said, it doesn't matter, you read it, you'll know French by the end. So I dutifully read it because I was made to read it. But I remember laughing my head off because by the time I had read about 10 pages, I started to catch on to what was saying, what the meaning was, because I knew a little bit of French, but very little bit. And I realized when things were really funny, and it's a very funny book. It's a really hilarious book. So then when school started, we got shipped to school. And
What do you mean shipped to school?
Sent to school.
Sent to school.
Yeah, sent to
Why
school.
did you go to school?
It was in Marseille, at Sainte-Anne, and it was École communale de filles à Sainte-Anne. That's what it was. It's a public school for girls. It was all girls, and my sister went into grade 1, I went into grade 3, which is not where I belong, but it was fine because it was all about learning the French, and my French was pretty decent. It did for a grade 3 French. It was adequate for a grade 3 French. And there was still a lot of songs and a lot of singing. I still remember those songs, you know.
How did you fit into that school?
Oh,
a little
fine.
girl coming from.
They were very good. You know what? The teachers were fabulous. The kids were fabulous. I mean, I don't remember anybody in particular that we made friends with, but I remember having a good time.
Were there other immigrants there or refugees?
I don't think so. There weren't any.
Any Jews?
No, not to my knowledge. But nobody bothered. And, you know, my father used to go off into Marseille and talk to people. And at one point they said, why don't you stay? And he said no, he didn't want to stay.
Were you in contact with the Jewish community when you were in
No,
Marseille?
yes and no, because what happened is we needed some vaccinations and we need medical certificates and things like that, and the Joint Commission sent us to Jewish physicians.
But no synagogue, going to the synagogue?
No, not in that period of time.
Okay.
We did nothing. It was just marking time. We got to South America just after New Year's. I think it was January the 2nd, or maybe even it was on New Year's Day, January 1st. I remember standing in line at immigration, and there was a local lady coming back from somewhere in France, and she was fanning herself and saying, "Que calor," and I didn't have the faintest idea what she said, but I nodded in agreement. Because I kind of thought that she was complaining about the heat, you know, so that was that. And then we got picked up by, you know, one of my mother's brothers, and we went he had a country place, and we went there. I think we got sick with Coke, because we drank too much Coke. Never drank Coke after.
As a little girl, you left in 1946, so you were 8-9 years old when you left Romania. Do you remember your feelings, your emotions, leaving one place, you don't know where you're going, then you're staying there, then you go into another place?
I don't know. I don't think so. I have to tell you, I don't think so. I wasn't. I think maybe my sister maybe more, but I don't think so. I I think to me it was like if my parents were there, it was fine. You know, I don't recall. I mean, I had some bones to pick with the place, but it had nothing to do with moving from one place to another. You know, it just was what it was.
So once you arrived in Uruguay, in Montevideo,
Yes.
right? How did life start for your family?
Well, it was actually that I remember was not an easy adjustment. But what happened is that one of my mother's brothers suggested that we hired this young woman who was best friends with his daughter, who was a first-year medical student, and to teach us Spanish. So she spent the summer coming daily to our house and teaching us Spanish. And it was mostly teaching my sister and I so we could go to school. And not only that, she went with my father to get us registered in school. So the public school said they were taking my sister in grade 1 and they would take me in grade 1. And this young woman said to my father wasn't happy. This girl said, under no circumstances, said they know enough to go where they belong. They know enough Spanish to get in where they belong. So he went to the public school. They said no. He went to somewhere else, and they said no. Then he went to the British school, and they said no. And he went to the Lycée Français, and they said yes. So they took my sister in grade 2, morning Spanish, afternoon French, and they took me in grade 5, morning Spanish, afternoon French, but it was a makeup class, and I didn't know that they had sent me to this makeup class. So I went in the morning when school started, and I did Spanish, and there was one girl by the name of Marta D'Amico, who was very sweet, and I kind of got sort of friendly with her that first morning. And we were sent home for lunch, and we lived about 4 short blocks from the lycée. And so I went home, I had lunch, and somehow I got a little bit late getting back from lunch. And she was a little bit late, and I didn't know where to go, and there was nobody to ask, so I followed her, and I ended up in the regular grade 5, in the septième, which is a grade 5 equivalent. I ended up in septième with her, which is not where I was supposed to go. And I wasn't very happy when they said that to me. The teacher, though, was very smart. What he said, you go, I'm going to give you an essay to do tonight when you go home. You can write any subject you want. Don't write a dialogue. Because that first half of the day he realized that there were some kids whose mother tongue was French, who were not up to a grade 5 level, although they belonged to a grade 5 by age and by other things, and they were still in grade, and they came from France as, migrants post-war, and their French wasn't good enough to fit where it was supposed to fit, so they were getting put 1 grade down if they didn't make that essay. That was his essay. It was the French language teacher. So I went home and I said, what essay do I do? And I did not have a vocabulary. But I remembered by memory a guignol, a marionette show that I had seen of Parc du Prado, which was hilarious. And I wrote down a summary of that as a dialogue. And I made, no mistakes, I made the grade. I got a 17 out of 20 on it. So I made the grade. It was 15 out of 20. I made the grade. By the end of the first month, I was the top of class in Spanish and in French. And you don't tell me that I can't do something, because I will go out of my way to show you that I can do it.
Did you finish all your secondary schooling in the Lycée
I
Français?
did not. The fees got too high. I would have liked to do a baccalaureate, but I couldn't do a French baccalaureate because I did not have a French citizenship, nor was I born in France, nor were any of my parents born in France, nor were they French citizens or any relatives who had French citizenship. So the school did not allow a baccalaureate. So also the fees got too high, and my father said, I can't afford it anymore. It's going to really put a strain. So so I went to the public school. I had no problem. But the advantage of having done those 2 years is that I had a double program in everything except in language and literature. And the language and literature was only an enrichment from what you got in Spanish. And so I had no problem in high school. So that was that, finished.
How did your parents settle financially in Montevideo?
Well, it was very interesting. During the war and in the immediate post-war war, there were a lot of people who from US were helping their relatives in Europe because they had no earnings. So there was a code, there was an interesting thing. People were putting money in the bank in the US, and people in Europe were paying their own money to the locals others who needed help. I don't know who my father was intermediary, but my mother we had a relative in New York whose wife was first cousin to my grandmother. And he opened a bank, an account at the Chase Bank under his name, which was was an escrowed account, and it was as a kind of a sponsored account by him, or else we couldn't have opened it as being in a war country that was not an allied country. And when we got to Uruguay, we had, the letters read, so-and-so is going to have a birthday, give them, would you please make sure that you don't forget that they have a birthday, to give them 10 roses. 10 roses were, I think, $1,000 or something. There was a code. It was violets, carnations, and roses. The lowest was violets, carnations were, I think, $10, and roses were $100 bills or something like that, and then the equivalent amount, and then you send back a letter. Oh, thank you very much for the reminder. You did not, I did not forget. I gave your relative the 10 roses, basically $1,000.
So he sponsored your parents
and so
at the beginning?
he had the money. So when we got to Uruguay, we had about $12,000, which was a lot of money in those days. And so we were able to start on that one. We had enough money to last us until we got there, and then we had that money to do it. And so my father ended up by opening a small dry cleaning business, and he had his own machines and did that.
His whole career in Uruguay?
Pardon?
Did he do that his whole career in Uruguay, or he got into some other stuff
No,
later?
he did all of that. He had an employee who was a very nice man, and who, when he retired, he took the business over. He paid him for the business. So that was my father's retirement money.
And your mother, did she work?
No, my mother just helped him in the business. They were also doing mending and things like that, which she was doing in the, sewing up buttons and things, that kind of stuff.
Where did you live? What kind of circumstances?
When we got there first, we rented an apartment in the city. It was in an interesting place. It was actually, street was called Uruguay Street. It was actually 3 blocks away from what was high school and then equivalent to Cégep. So just walking distance. The road was a little bit fraught because the street we had to cross, they had all the prostitution houses in town because prostitution was legal. And I had a couple of friends in high school and later in pre-meds and so on, who used to have to take that street to get their buses to go home. And we were accosted a couple of times and sort of just ran away, of course. And so tried to find other routes, but that was the shortest one. So in the end, we always took it, but we always made sure that we always walked 3 or 4 of us together. And so we never got into trouble. And we used to giggle after we ran away. I said, oh, these guys, whatever.
Did you stay on that road, lived on that road?
No, we actually moved into a condominium apartment about 3 blocks from the beach. Very beautiful. It had actually 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, kitchen, and a large hallway. There was some customization, but we kept the central hallway because I had a piano, a baby grand, and it went in. We needed a space for it, and we put it there. Living dining room, 1 bedroom that was mine, a main bedroom. There was a bathroom that was shower. There was another one that was a 3-piece. They were side by side. It was interesting because it was 2 bedrooms, the showers, then a little room that was supposed to be a maid's room, but my sister declared she wanted that one for her room. Next to it there was a tiny bathroom that had a toilet. That had room for a washing machine. We eventually got a washing machine there, and it wasn't a ringer. It was a spin one. Although most of them were ringers, ours was not a ringer. It was a spin machine, and it opened into a balcony where you could. There was some opaque fiberglass extension, so you could hang clothes to dry because you didn't have a dryer. But that was a back balcony, so you were allowed to hang clothes there. It worked very well. We had a very nice kitchen. It had beautiful pale gray cupboards because my father liked gray color. And other people had increased their kitchen to make it into like a dinette and additional stuff, but they didn't have a piano, or they had a vertical that they put in the living room. We had this baby grand, we needed the space, so we kept the original layout of the condominium. And it was a lovely place to be, and it had a front balcony. My mother had all kinds of plants there, and she had a wall with them. And that's what we had.
How did your parents' kind of social life and your social life develop there?
So what we belonged to was Montevideo had quite a few Jewish congregations because our family was a little bit peculiar. My mother's relatives were a little bit peculiar. We opted for not joining the largest one, which had both Hungarian, a lot of Hungarian and some Polish Jews. We didn't. We opted for what was called Nova Congregación Israelita, which was all German-speaking Jews. Orthodox synagogue. It was actually very nice. It had lots of youth programs, and we joined those programs. It was a nice congregation. We had a few friends from there. Our family doctor belonged there. he actually was not a German Jew. He was actually originally from Latvia. The family was. I think he was born in South America, but his older sibling was not. And he married a Jewish woman who was of German origin and spoke German in the house. So, you know, it was them, and then there was another couple of families that they socialized with. And then we had the kids to socialize with, and we belonged to the Students' Union.
These people that your parents socialized with, were they also immigrants or already people who were
there was a mixture. There was a lawyer who had been a judge in Romania by the name of Geiger. We were friends with them. There was a widowed woman, German but who had converted, and who was migrating to South America with with 4 of her sons. So her husband went into the underground in Germany and he got killed as a fighter. His oldest son was married and his daughter-in-law went to, this was an interesting family because this woman, Tante Anna, there were 3 girls in the family, they all married Jewish men, they all converted. And they all brought up Jewish children. One of them left to South America early on, I think just before Kristallnacht, and started the chocolate factory that was called Femina. And that chocolate in South America at one point in time was very well known. And it was, I can guarantee you, excellent chocolate, on par with the best. She stayed behind, lost her husband, lost her oldest son, but came with her 4 sons, the other 4 sons, to South America, was migrating because her sister was there, and her sister said, "Okay, come on, you know, you did this, you tried, tried to save them, you were unsuccessful with those, but just leave, come." So she went. I don't know what happened to the other sister, but that's besides the point. I never heard the story. And so and my mother became friends with her, and we used to see them regularly. We went to all their children's weddings. They were a bit older than my sister and I, and that's who we socialized with. In school, we were a gang of in university in pre-meds. We were 3 of us, all children of immigrants, post-war, but not necessarily Jewish. One was Italian, the other one, no, both of them were Italian. One was Italian, the other one was Italian from Trieste, which is kind of a mixed area and then when we got to university, there were 2 additional ones, also children of immigrants from Spain for whatever reason, and the other one also from the Trieste area, but she was a Croat or a Slovenian or whatever, but they've been persecuted, so the parents left. Not Jewish, but they were for whatever reason. So we were a group of 5 who jumped together at university, and we stayed friends for a long time. I lost contact with them quite a few years after I came to Canada.
Did you finish med school in Montevideo?
No. I finished med school in Toronto.
In Toronto. So I think we come to your husband, how you met your husband, because that's how you ended up in Canada.
That's how I ended up in Canada. My husband was Auschwitz, Dachau, Buna survivors. Orwa had 6 or 7 of them. One of them not being a Jew, was a Polish guy. Anyway, he ended up in Australia. He actually was supposed to go to Palestine, but through a set of circumstances ended up in Australia instead. When they were in Treviso. Treviso had collected quite a few Jewish kids who were still in reasonably good shape post-war, and pulled them together in a camp and trained them. They were supposed to go clandestine migration to Palestine, and they knew what the score was. The score was that when the Jewish brigade from the British Army went on furlough, they were given uniforms, and they were going back in that way. But one of the people who was running the camp happened to be related to his family, and he said, "You can go to Palestine, but do you have your baccalaureate? Because if you go without a high school finished, you have no options. And if you don't want to become a farmer, you become a farmer. But if you want to do something else, there's no way you're going to be able to do it." So he said to him, "Go home, get it, and come back." So he went back home. He finished his last high school.
Home was where for
to
him?
Oradea Mare.
Oh, he was also from Romania.
Yeah, he was also from. They knew my mother's family knew who they were. They weren't friends, but they knew who they were. They were actually from Belényes. Okay, and this town that is called Roșia Montana now, but it was called Roșia, plain Roșia. He lived in Roșia. He was from Roșia. There were two Jewish families in Roșia. But some of his family was in Belényes. And one of his uncles, who had been in concentration camp, came back, was actually a public notary. And he was in Belényes at the time. He ended up in Israel eventually, shortly thereafter. But he said, so he went to high school in Oradea Mare, got his baccalaureate, went back to Belényes, and from there he was going back to the camp. However, he got sidetracked in Vienna because one of his cousins, who had also been in concentration camp or in forced labor camp somewhere and would come back, was running one of the DP camps in Vienna in the I think the American, because Vienna was also divided into 4, which I didn't know until he said that it was divided into 4. And they were at the Rothschild Hospital. And the Rothschild Hospital was the hotbed for clandestine migration. And he said, "Come and help me because I need help to make out these DP cards so the people have some documents." And so he was working there. And he got a license to ride a motorbike. I have a picture of him with his motorbike, with a leather jacket. I don't have his motorbike thing, but he was 17, 18 with, tapshifilesh. But whatever. And that's when he didn't know that his father had survived. And that's where he found out. And how he found out was that he gets this call from the Australian embassy in Vienna. They're looking for a client, and they found him, and can he come up to the embassy? You have an affidavit to migrate to Australia. Who signed it? Well, your father's brother, who was a sergeant in the Australian army. And they got a privilege to have relatives who survived, to have them immigrate right away. So what happened is that but she said, "I don't know where my father is. I don't know whether he even survived." And they said to him, "Yes, but he survived because he's in the survivors on the Red Cross's list." So it turns out that what happened is that his father had been one of the people who had been picked up by a group of monks somewhere from Austria, took them up to the monastery and nursed them back to health, and had them there working until they would find their way to go anywhere. And so that's how he got reunited with his father, and his father wanted to go to Australia. So they ended up in Australia. Well, what happened then, that was a little more interesting thing, is that he, either in Paris or I don't know where, he ran into the wife and the two daughters of the other family from Russia, and he married her. But he had to take her to Australia, so he adopted her daughter, who was already married and had two little girls by that time, because time had passed. So, and whose husband was also a forced labor, he was in a forced labor camp.
And had died.
Well, my husband's stepmother's husband had died, but the stepsister's husband was also, and they became very good friends. And we get a family relationship mostly because they were very good friends. So he had to adopt her, and she was his wife, and so they could bring the whole family. Now this application became an application for this whole family.
You mean your
my husband, and that's how they ended up in Australia. Yeah.
Let's go back a little bit, because first of all, what's your husband's name?
My husband's name was Armin Klein.
And when was he born? What year?
1927, May 31.
Okay. So what happened he was in camp. What happened to his mother?
His mother died in Bergen-Belsen. His father and him were together in the camp until his father got typhus. And then he lost track of him. They were together in the same barrack, in the same camp all along. And my husband always says he wouldn't have been there, because he always kept giving him instructions. That's how he survived.
But they were all deported together from Russia to
Auschwitz. She ended up in Bergen-Belsen, got typhus and died. We don't know the date. No, we don't have a record of the date. He and his father were together.
No other children?
No other children. As many people in the countryside, she had a postpartum infection, and with her second child, who actually died the crib death. So she had no more children, and so he was left as an only child. But she had a lot of people, including this cousin who was in Vienna afterwards, who grew up in their house. It's one of the cousins who grew up in their house, plus other two cousins whose mother was one of his mother's sisters was widowed young. They had a cement mine. The family owned a cement mine, and he got some silicosis, and he died of pulmonary insufficiency. So she was left alone with two boys, and she had to work. So my mother-in-law took them. And she took this boy because he was part of one of the Klein clan who was in the really poor side of the family. So that's what they were using. They were, he grew up. He always called my husband his brother because he grew up in the same household. So that's why my husband, when he said, "Come and help me," my husband felt obligated to go and help him. And so he didn't know whether his husband had survived. So he said, "Well, at least I have him. I have nobody else. I have him." So that's how he ended up in Vienna at
the Rothschild. Now we can go back to Australia. So they all went to Australia.
They all ended up in Australia, and eventually in
Melbourne.
In Melbourne. In Melbourne, his father got a 10-acre piece of land and a little bit of loan from the Australian government, and put up a chicken farm, a poultry farm, which was as automated as you could do it in those days. And he had been a railway engineer in his days, but he was traveling a lot. And when they got married, my mother-in-law said to him, it doesn't behoove a Jewish guy observant Jewish guy yet, because he came from an extraordinarily crazy Orthodox family, to the point that my husband says the kids ran away from home because he was so tyrannical. You know, he was just impossible. His grandfather, although, you know, he said he had steely blue eyes, and he says, I was 5 years old and I asked him, you know, is there a God and what is God? And he says, if you don't believe in God, then I have nothing to do with you, or something like that. But still continued to teach him. But, you know, it was like...
That was his father's father, right?
That his father's father. And so, you know, these kids were like, really didn't want to have anything. It was a turn off for them. But said, you know, she said to him, it doesn't behoove him driving, you're going to have to travel on Shabbat and whatever, and what kind of an example are you going to give your children? And so he said, I have to do something. So they bought this farm, and it wasn't a farm, they found a mill, and he used his skills. So he made a poultry farm, and he used some of his mechanical skills that he knew to do as much automation as he could. There was a little bit of an incline on this land. It was 10 acres, which is about 40 hectares. And he had 3 or 4 compounds with 10,000 chicken apiece in a free range. And he put a little railway track down. He went to the railway yards and he begged, borrowed, and paid pennies for the sleepers, put down the tracks, and made a tripper so that every time he got to the door, it would trip open. The little railway car would block it so the chicken wouldn't run out, throw out the feed to the chicken. And as he went past, it automatically closed. It was spring-loaded, it closed. And then went on to the next one. And at night, they went by hand, collected the eggs, put them on the little railway car, mini railway car, and took them like that. And those were kosher eggs. They went to the kosher market. They had a hechsher. It was all done nicely. And they grew grapes, and they made some kosher brandy. They also took vegetables to the thing, and out of, I don't know, 1,000 pounds and 10 acres of land, when he died of a stroke because he didn't take care of himself, he was supposed to have no salt in his food, and he just loaded it with salt. I think he had a form of PTSD, and he was just, you know.
But he was a wealthy man when he died.
The farm was worth quite a bit of money, but his widow frittered it away. And my sister-in-law always said that her mother is a bitch on wheels. She was not a very nice woman. She used to nag him non-stop, to the point that my father said, she's my wife, I have to put up with her. He said, as soon as he helped him finish the buildings and get this thing going, he said to her, you now get out of here and go to university.
So that's what your husband did?
And he graduated in dentistry out of Brisbane University. He got a special scholarship as a survivor, a bursary. He didn't have to repay it. It was a grant. And that was it.
You still didn't tell me how you two met.
Well, I had an aunt. Well, my mother's older sister had no children, and her mission in life was to have her nieces married off well. She had 11 nieces and only 1 nephew in that generation. None of it succeeded. She tried, but none of it succeeded. Only mine succeeded. Anyway, so that's how. It sort of helped. We wrote each other and sent tapes back and forth for 2 years before he came to see me. And then we had 2 weeks.
But she brought the two of you together?
He came to visit his aunt, because his aunt was best friends with my aunt.
Where?
In Montevideo.
In Montevideo.
And
okay.
so she was nagging him to come and visit her because he was at that time in North America, and she said, well, you're not in Australia anymore, why don't you come and visit me, so on and so forth. And so he eventually gave in and came down, and then I had 2 weeks to make a decision, and I can tell you he worked so hard at convincing me. I've never seen anybody work so hard at convincing anybody to now, you know, I used to get flowers, and I used to get pens, and I used to get stuff by mail. He was courting by mail, but he wasn't, you know, I had never met him. I hadn't seen even a picture of him, so I didn't know what he looked like. And
But
he
wait,
looked like,
he wrote to you before you met in Montevideo?
yes,
So how?
for 2 years.
So who kind of
Our two aunts,
Okay, so they decided that you two should be writing to each other.
yes.
I see. Okay. So and then after 2 years, he
Yeah,
came
well, I
and-
got tapes, and I sent tapes and stuff. I still have them.
So and after 2 years, he came, visited in Montevideo, and that's when you first met.
Yes.
Where was he living? Was he still in Australia?
No, he was at the time in Canada. Because what happened is that after they graduated, he worked for a few years, and a whole bunch of his former classmates said, "Oh, let's go around the world, you know, and see some world before we settle down, and whatever and whatever and whatever." And the thing is that it was a really funny mishmash, Sadat Vedat group. There was one Australian, Irish Australian, Irish Italian Australian, because there's a lot of Irish Italians in Australia. There was one Chinese from Hong Kong. There was, I don't know, there were a couple more. There were a couple of other Australian, Irish Italians like that, and they went to I don't even remember where they started, but they ended up in two of them ended up in Canada. One of them married a Chinese girl from Philippines. She was part of the refugee group. She was born in Philippines and graduated in Philippines, and she was part of this refugee group. That she was a physician. She part of this refugee group during the Chiang Kai-shek, during the revolution, the communist revolution in China, who fled with the emperor to different places, and they ended up in Philippines. A whole group. That's how Chinese ended up in Philippines. And she ended up there. And she finished medicine, she became a family physician or something, but she wanted to become an anesthetist as well. And she went to Mount Sinai in New York to do a residency. And this group of 5 guys who was traveling together, they also wanted to get to New York to different programs, to head and neck surgery, and the plan was to go to Guy's Hospital in London, which is the big head and neck surgery center, to learn there, and so on and so forth. But what happened is that they ended up in different places. 2 of them went back to Australia. One of them became the Dean of Dentistry in Melbourne. And then Brian and my husband ended up in Canada. My husband also wanted to go to New York, but they couldn't get funding, and somehow Brian got the funding, but the others didn't get the funding. So they all ended up in different places, but they spent some time together in Halifax at Dalhousie University, and a lot of what they did was head and neck surgery for motorcycle accidents. So they learned a lot there.
And your husband was in Halifax
Yes,
too?
he was for 1 year, and they got a second degree there. It was what they call an addendum year. They just take them and they give them a DDS. And they said it's a cheat because they go back and call themselves doctors without a PhD. So
And-
because those degrees in the British system are bachelor's degrees.
And did he stay in? So where did he go from Halifax to
So
Toronto?
he went from Halifax to Toronto. I'm not even sure why. Both of them came to Toronto. Both Brian and my husband came to Toronto. And he married, the Chinese girl came to Toronto as well, and they got married in Toronto. Brian and the Chinese woman got married in Toronto. They eventually ended up in Vancouver.
And your husband went down to see you.
And my husband was actually, they were both working as associates in a practice, in two different practices. And my husband there was an associate in this practice who had been his classmate, and he came to Canada on purpose as an immigrant to Canada. And the owner of that practice was born in Canada, but was originally of Dutch extraction, and had been in the military during World War II. He was a little bit older than this group, and he had been in the military during World War II, and he picked up TB when he was overseas. And he worked for a while, and then he got sick, so he had to go into the sanatorium, and they said, well, Len has to go into the sanatorium, and I need somebody to be with me. I can't, his former classmate by the name of Alan Irwood said, I need somebody to be with me. Do you mind staying a year? Because Len is going to be for a year there. So a year passed, and they needed him for longer, so he stayed. And that happened to coincide with the time that the two aunts kind of cooked this thing up. And that's how the thing went. And then, so for whatever reason or other, he just didn't quite get back. To the point that for years after we were married, for quite a few years, when February came and the weather got really bad, because Toronto was not like it's Toronto now. We used to have piles of snow. And he would say, I'm going back to Australia. This is no climate for people.
What year did you get married? In what year?
62.
And in Toronto or in Montevideo?
No, in Montevideo.
And after that you came up?
I came up.
And that's where you finished your studies?
Yeah, and that's when I came. It was very interesting because he had applied actually early on, almost shortly after we started corresponding, for a landed immigrant status, and nothing ever happened. They never ever followed up on that file. So he went to immigration, and they had to rummage for a while because nothing had been done. It had been left dormant. So when he came, he said, take a 6 months visa. And, we have 6 months to make a decision what we do. U of T will either, and I said, but I have 6 months, I'm done in 6 months. And he said, doesn't matter, it's always better if you get a degree there than you get a degree here. Here than where I was. So it was, so I took the 6 months visa, and we went on a honeymoon, Rio, Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, New York. His stepsister was then in New York, and then came to
Canada.
Back to Canada. And I didn't say that I was married. They said, I came as Agnes Stössel. So I'm Agnes Stössel, that was my passport, right? So who are you going to stay? I'm going to stay with Dr. Klein. So nobody asked any questions. I was really concerned that they were going to start asking questions. That was fine. So we happened to arrive the night of August the 5th to August the 6th, after midnight from New York. That was the first day that the movie houses were open in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Ontario. And it was the day that was also the first Monday in August was the day that was also declared a banking holiday, so a holiday in Ontario. August 6, 1962. Okay. So we got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to go downtown. There was nothing. He had a bachelor apartment in Scarborough, a big, huge room. I think he paid all of $60 rent for that place. Nice kitchen, small kitchen, but nice kitchen, decent bathroom. Few crackers and a can of sardines and tea, few bags of tea. That's all it was in the cupboard. Not that there was nothing, but his sister and the daughters and the brother-in-law had spent their holiday there, and whatever was left over, they they emptied it. I mean, they bought what they needed as well, but they emptied everything else. So, but we had that. So he said to me, you know, he said, friends are for something. We're going to go. And so we went. We had lunch with one couple. We had dinner with another couple. One with the Irwood where he worked, and the other one with the Chinese, where the wife is Chinese, and we had dinner with them, I think, or lunch with them and dinner with the other ones. I don't remember which way it was, but that's what it was. Following morning, early morning, we went to immigration on St. Clair Avenue. So we go in, and you take a number and you wait, and the guy asks what you want, and my husband says, this is what we want, you know, here is this, the file, and whatever, and whatever. The guy starts screaming off the top of his head, what do you think you're trying to put over us? So my husband looks at him and he says, what are you screaming at? She's not here illegally. All you have to do is let us in. They tell us she can stay. And if she doesn't want to, and if they don't want her to stay, we're going back to Australia. Oh, they didn't like that. They didn't like that at all. So we go in, and the guy, of course, inside was very different kettle of fish. He pulled in the file, and he says, "Oh my God, he always wanted to immigrate to Australia, but it's so difficult that he gave up on it." So I had no problem. 6 weeks later, my papers were fixed.
When did you live in Toronto for a while?
We lived in Toronto. We rented an apartment downtown behind the Maple Leaf Gardens. So we lived there until 64. It was actually the Beatles came in 63, and there was this concert, and it was hot summer, so there was no air conditioning. Windows were open. You could hear the whole concert and the whole screaming. I mean, those are things, you know, you kind of remember. And I used to tell my kids when they were quite in their teens, they'd say, "Oh my God," you know, that was just so exciting, right? You get the Beatles, you heard the Beatles, right? And then he said, I said, we need a 2-bedroom apartment. So he was going to rent, and that apartment cost about $120 or $130. And so when he went to rent the 2-bedroom apartment, they wanted $200. And he said, that's too expensive. He said, we're going to do far better if we buy a house. No money to buy a house. Well, I have to correct myself. Because what happened is that there was a custom for a dowry in South America, because life was very difficult, and all professionals and all, you know, that was the custom. So my sister and I told our father that if you dare to, we knew that he couldn't afford it, or that we didn't want him to afford it, basically because it was part of his retirement money. I said, if you put yourself into debt for a wedding or for a dowry, we are going to walk out of your house. That's it. That's the only time that we ever talked back to him. We just said it to him out of the blue. And so, however, when I left, he gave me $2,000. And he said, if something happens and you don't know, you never know. If something happens, you know, you got something to start on. So we looked for 2 houses. The prices were too expensive. And lo and behold, at a point in time in January of '64, my husband found this house that for whatever reason was not selling. It was a side split. People didn't like it. And we had no money, not a penny, except those $2,000. And he bought the house. He went to see it. He bought the house. I wasn't very happy because I hadn't seen it, but it was supposed to be my birthday present for that year. And so he bought it and paid for it, took a straight loan for the down payment, got a mortgage, and the house cost us under $200 with utilities, mortgage, and everything. And we used the $2,000 to buy, because it came without, there were no utility, there was no fridge, there was no dry washer, there was no dryer, there was no stove, there were no blinds. So we spent the $2,000 on fridge, washer, dryer, whatever was needed, and storm windows and doors.
That was still in Toronto?
That was still in Toronto. It was in Don Mills. It was walking distance almost to the ramp to the Don Valley Parkway. When the house was bought, the York Mills exit wasn't built. The Don Valley was only to Lawrence, and the joke was that you know, the York, you go that last piece before you go get off the Don Valley, you go forward on a snowy day, you go forward 3 feet and you slide back 9.
Were your kids born there, still in Toronto?
Yeah, my kids were born in Toronto.
Oh, so when did you move to Ottawa and why?
In '72.
Why?
Because I went back into training, into residency in Ottawa, which I didn't want to take, but I ended up by taking it because my husband talked me into it. And I don't know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes I think it was a bad thing. I still think sometimes it was a bad thing, but that's another story which I'm not going to confuse.
That's when you moved here to this area?
Well, we moved to an area. When we moved, I sort of got confused with the last piece, and I saw some of these buildings, and I said, this is a beautiful area, I would really love to live here. But we had bought an inexpensive house because our house wasn't sold yet in Toronto. I bought a house, we bought a very inexpensive house in Beacon Hill, which is down below. And but a year after, we bought another house in Beacon Hill that was slightly bigger, and it got so that it got uncomfortable because there was no place where you could do anything. There are too many doors going into a place, and there were no walls, and the family room, you could do nothing. It was, all you could have is a sofa, a TV, and my piano, and you couldn't do anything. I was sewing, I was knitting, I was doing things for the kids, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. I had to take it into the laundry room, put it in a closet, take it out, taking the sewing machine out, put it on the kitchen table, bring it back. It was a pain. So my husband said to the fellow who was a builder who had done his office at the Saint Laurent Shopping Center, he said, can you add a piece to the house, like a family room to the house? And he said, I'll tell you, you're not going to get more for that house when you sell it anyway. So my husband said to him, if I find a piece of land that's inexpensive, will you put up a house for me? And he said yes. And so we ended up by finding this lot, and he put up a house for us that we designed, and that's what we got. And by that time, the house in Toronto was sold, everything was done, you know. We were financially reasonably solvent. He was earning well, I was working and earning. My mother was looking for the kids for a while. Because because she wanted to, and I was back into training. And then when they started to run into their teens, she said that's it. She couldn't handle them anymore, especially the boys. They got really quite rambunctious, quite naughty, and quite difficult to manage.
Did you?
Sorry, I have to record it.
So growing up, as your kids were growing up, did you belong to the Jewish community? Did you celebrate was there
In
an
Toronto,
observance?
yes, we did. We actually were founding members of one of the large synagogues that's called Bet Tikva, and that's how we got into a conservative synagogue. And when we left, and the kids started day school, and they continued day school here.
Jewish day school.
Jewish day school in Ottawa. Unfortunately, it only went to elementary school. It's not. We still don't have a high school. And now people are working. Every so often, people were working, and they were temporarily a grade or two of high school. But eventually, the kids had to go back to the public school system in Ottawa. But the population is large enough now. There is enough demand for high school that they can now move in Ottawa too.
Do you belong to a synagogue?
Yes,
here?
we do.
Yeah,
We
yes.
belong to what's called Kehilat Bet Israel. We were in the Orthodox synagogue, which was close to home, almost downtown. But then the population moved out to the periphery, and we had another affiliate that's called Bet Tikva, which still exists, and it's an Orthodox synagogue. But it was too far for us to go, and when the conservative synagogue and the remnant of the old synagogue decided to merge, we went with Kehilat Bet Israel, which is KBI. It was called Agudat Israel before, and now it's called Kehilat Bet Israel, KBI. And I stayed, and I sort of am active there, and I do canvassing for United Jewish Appeal and so on, and a few other things that I'm asked to do, and that's it.
What did you, as the kids were growing up, what did you observe at home? What kind of Jewish traditions did you observe at home?
Just about everything, and my father gave a lot of money to charity, and after Israel became, even though he couldn't afford, he used to buy large sums of Israel bonds, which he paid.
Your
My
father or
my
your
father
father?
bought, we were in Uruguay then, and he bought fairly large denominations. I mean, $1,000, $1,500 was the largest one at the time, and he used to buy those, borrow the money, and pay it off during the year, because he didn't have the cash on hand.
When your kids were smaller, was your household kosher as they were growing
Yes.
up? Yeah.
Yes, I keep a sort of kosher now because I've been trying to train her, but she's not trainable. So a lot of the times, especially during high holidays, I just cook my own stuff. I rarely eat what she does. If she makes something like fish or egg dish, I will have it. But I won't have anything else. I don't necessarily buy kosher meat because it's too salty, and it's not good for me because I've had an aortic valve replaced, and I've had a nasty bout of endocarditis a little over a year ago, and endocarditis can be, and I'm really not looking for trouble, and I've finally been given a clean bill of health as far as my heart is concerned just last week, actually just week on Wednesday. It was kind of, I was very happy to hear that. So
Did your boys have bar mitzvah
yes.
and bat mitzvah, your girl?
No, because we still belong to the Orthodox synagogue, she didn't have, and so she said, yes, you can have a bat mitzvah, but it's not going to be like the boys. She said, then I don't want it. That was the conversation. The boys did a whole Torah reading, stem to stern, for their bar mitzvah. Not that they're doing anything now or that they're keeping anything. Let's not talk about that.
How about your circle of friends with your husband? Who
We really
were
didn't
your-
have that many. I mean, there were two Jewish families in the thing, both coming from Romania. They moved. They had two children. The ones in the house at the end of the street don't have any children. I rarely see them now since they moved away, and when they were still here, we used to see each other. And they seem to be not very social or communicative. They have a couple of friends. I've run into them a couple of times at the art center. but because of COVID, I haven't kept up my subscription.
But I'm thinking not now, but in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
And we in the 70s and 80s, yes, we had. It was, a lot of them were immigrants or descendants of
Jewish?
Yes, and were mixed, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And we used to have, dinner parties and go to their places for dinner parties.
Was the war something that was a topic?
And my sister and I used to do parties for New Year's Eve, until it got such a pain, because we always had a nasty snowstorm or a nasty freezing rain that, bombed out a couple of times. And so my sister decided, that's it, we're not doing anything anymore.
I just lost my question. Yes. Was the war a topic that you would talk about among your friends? Your war experiences or your husband's war experiences, was that something that was talked about in the family and among friends?
Like what?
Like what you went through the war, what he went through the war.
You know what? He never talked about it until towards the end of his life, when occasionally he would drop a few things here and there. And I have a friend who was a hidden child, and she was about 5 years old, and she sort of had, and I don't know to what extent she has a bad experience or not, but she remembers it as a very bad experience, because she was hidden by a Dutch family. Her mother was a widowed mother, was a single mother. She was widowed because her husband was in the Dutch resistance, and he got killed early on as part of the Dutch resistance. And so she had this one child, and she was a nurse, and she worked in a hospital as a nurse. So Ellie was very active in the Holocaust education stuff, and between her and I, we bulldozed him one time to actually write up something and present it at one of the Holocaust memorials, and he didn't want to. It was held in the Jewish Community Center. It wasn't one of the official venues. And he simply, he did it. He was very reluctant. There is a one-pager which he wrote, and all the kids have it. I have it. And I think one of the papers, who's no longer in existence, interviewed him once. And I have that somewhere, but I can't find it. I was looking for it the other day, not because of this, but because I was thinking of looking for it and putting the 2 pages together. And I couldn't find it, so I have to look some more. I'm sure I have it, but I just have to look for it.
How about yourself? Is that something you share with people or with your children, your story?
I actually, he never shared with the children. I never did, actually. It's just because by the time I probably would have shared, they were kind of doing their own thing already. They were out of the house, married, so on. But they have sheets. I send those sheets to their kids, and with the things in Israel now, I've been sending selected things to her to say, you show it to the kids, make the kids read it.
When you got married, was it important for you to marry a Jew?
Yes.
Was it important to marry someone from Europe or a refugee?
Not necessarily. That was not in my books. I mean, there was nobody around, and my father, much as he wanted me to be fully independent, he really also wanted me to get married because he wanted to have grandchildren. So, I mean, that's what it was about for him, I guess,
Why was it important to marry a Jew for you?
Because I never thought of marrying anybody else. To me, that was just a given fact. And, there were a couple of boys who were courting me when I was at Hillel. Not Hillel, it was Kadima, at the Jewish Student Union. But I just couldn't stomach them. And I used to tell my mother, they smell, they have a bad breath, and my mother said to me something very interesting. She said, you know you have the right one when you either like the smell or you don't smell anything. Something like that, to that effect.
Do you think that your Holocaust experience influenced the way you raised your children, that it had anything to do with the way you...
I think probably it had, but I'm not so sure. I can't tell you because my husband had I think probably a counter-influence on that one, and he used to always say, I would never go back, I would have never put my feet back into a synagogue if you wouldn't have made me go with you.
That's what your husband said to you?
Yes, that's what he said once. But you know, he was very happy coming. Once he came with me, he was very happy, because I would have never gone by myself. And he was more than happy to take the kids. Notwithstanding all of that, he used to take them every Shabbat with him, even if I, for some reason, couldn't go because I was a resident and I had other things to do. He would pack them up and take them. So, you know, that's what it was. And that when they were young, they insisted that I keep kosher. So I kept kosher, you know. But, you know, now they're just whatever.
My last question is, why did you decide to share your story now? I know I called you, but what made you
the reason why
decide
I shared, there are a number of reasons. And I always felt a little bit like a fraud because by comparison, I was not, you know, I had it easy, really, by comparison. And I never thought that as being so different, especially when you look at people who survived concentration camp, especially when I looked at my husband, and especially when, you know, he had a tattoo. He was already of the second lot were tattoos, because the first bunch didn't have tattoos, the second lot had tattoos. And then there were some people who were in similar situation to mine, who felt exactly the same way originally, and decided that they had to share stories as their parents were aging, and not enough had been said. And if they heard any stories, they would repeat those stories and of how they looked at those stories. And I said, you know, they have a point. And when I found that my husband didn't share, because he would have had something to share, and I think while he probably wouldn't have shared, I think I owe it to his memory to share at least something. And I think I owe it to my children so that I really understand where they come from. And so that those are really the reasons why I decided to share. Because it's kind of l'dor vador, from generation to generation.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, that's about it. So, you know, it makes me feel a little better, because as time goes on, I feel much less like a fraud, you know, and I make different points. I finally decided I'm going to speak to schools, and I spoke a couple of times. And what I underscore for them is the fact that people are people, and you have to take everybody and judge them on their own, and not by the color of their skin, and not by the religion they carry, and not by the ethnicity they carry. And that's repeated over and over and over. And I said, if you keep that in mind, and you judge people by who they are and get to learn them, you'll find that people are really good, and you bring out the best in them.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you very much for the interview.